In the quiet spaces between official releases and developer interviews, players began assembling fragments into larger narratives, piecing together connections that the games themselves never quite confirmed. These theories emerged slowly, passed through forums and playground conversations, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Some collapsed under scrutiny, while others persisted for decades, woven so deeply into the fan base that distinguishing them from canon became nearly impossible. Before we settle in, maybe tap subscribe for more calm stories, and share where in the world you're watching from tonight. And we begin with the earliest whispers that would shape how millions of players understood the Pokémon world itself. The first theory to capture widespread attention emerged from the gravestones in Lavender Town's Pokémon Tower, where careful readers noticed names carved into the memorial stones that matched the player character's rival. This observation sparked speculation that the rival's Raticate had died between the SS Anne encounter and the Pokémon Tower meeting, explaining why the evolved rat never appeared in the rival's team again. The theory gained traction through its narrative elegance, transforming a simple roster change into a story about loss and the consequences of pushing Pokémon too hard in battle. Players pointed to the rival's dialogue in Lavender Town, where he asks whether the player's Pokémon are dead, as evidence that he was processing his own grief rather than simply taunting. The theory spread through early internet forums and schoolyards, becoming one of the first widely shared pieces of Pokémon speculation. What made the Raticate theory compelling was how it reframed the rival's character arc, suggesting that his increasingly aggressive behavior stemmed from trauma rather than simple competitiveness. The timeline aligned perfectly, with the Raticate disappearing from his team immediately after the SS Anne, where players battled him in cramped quarters with no Pokémon Center nearby. The implication was that the Raticate sustained injuries during that battle and died before the rival could reach proper medical care, teaching him that Pokémon were fragile despite their battle prowess. This interpretation added emotional weight to a character who otherwise seemed one-dimensional, driven only by the desire to prove superiority. The theory persisted even after later games introduced mechanics like fainting rather than death, because it touched something deeper about the relationship between trainers and their Pokémon. Another detail appears when we look closer at the game's programming limitations, which some players interpreted as intentional design choices with narrative significance. The Cubone evolutionary line sparked one of the most enduring theories, built on the Pokédex entry stating that Cubone wears its dead mother's skull as a helmet. Players noticed that Cubone could be bred to produce more Cubone, creating a logical problem since each new Cubone should require its mother's death to obtain its signature skull. The theory evolved to suggest that Cubone was actually the orphaned pre-evolution of Kangaskhan, with the skull representing trauma rather than literal bone. This would explain why Kangaskhan appeared with a baby already in its pouch, as if it had lost something it was trying to replace. The theory connected disparate elements into a coherent, if dark, narrative about maternal loss and the ways Pokémon adapted to tragedy. The Cubone-Kangaskhan connection gained that additional support from unused sprite data discovered in later years, showing what appeared to be a baby Kangaskhan sprite that matched Cubone's proportions more closely than the in-game baby. Players speculated that the evolutionary line had been altered late in development, severing the connection but leaving traces in the Pokédex entries and item descriptions. The theory became self-reinforcing, with each new piece of circumstantial evidence strengthening the narrative that Game Freak had intended a darker story but pulled back before release. The discovery of Missing No and other glitch Pokémon only deepened the sense that the games contained hidden truths waiting to be uncovered through careful observation and technical exploration. The war theory emerged from close reading of the early game's environmental storytelling, particularly the notable absence of adult male characters in Kanto's civilian population. Players observed that most towns featured elderly people, women, and children, with adult men appearing primarily as gym leaders, scientists, or members of criminal organizations. This demographic imbalance suggested that a recent war had decimated Kanto's male population, leaving behind a society still recovering from trauma. Lieutenant Surge's dialogue about his time in the war became central evidence, as he explicitly referenced combat experience that seemed disconnected from the otherwise peaceful Pokémon world. The theory proposed that the war had been fought using Pokémon as weapons, explaining both the population decline and the emphasis on keeping powerful creatures under tight regulation through the gym system. The war theory recontextualized many background details that seemed innocuous on first playthrough. Professor Oak's research into cataloging Pokémon took on new significance as a post-war effort to understand the creatures that had been weaponized during the conflict. The rival's father's absence became part of the larger pattern of missing men, suggesting that the player character's own father had also died in combat. Team Rocket's existence made more sense as a group of war veterans who couldn't reintegrate into civilian life, turning to crime because battle was all they knew. Giovanni's position as both a gym leader and crime boss suggested a world where the lines between legitimate authority and organized violence had blurred during wartime and never quite recovered. Fans pointed to Pokémon Origins, an anime special that showed a more mature depiction of the Kanto region, as partial confirmation of the war theory's plausibility. The special included darker themes and more serious tone than the main anime series, suggesting that the Pokémon world contained depths that younger audiences weren't meant to explore. The theory became a lens through which players re-examined the entire franchise, looking for signs of trauma and violence beneath the cheerful surface. Some theorists extended the concept to other regions, suggesting that each generation's story took place against the backdrop of different historical conflicts that shaped regional culture and Pokémon populations. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the genetic engineering experiments hinted at throughout the series, starting with Mewtwo's creation, but extending far beyond that single legendary Pokémon, the Tsutsuga's. Burned Mansion on Cinnabar Island contained journal entries describing attempts to create the strongest Pokémon through cloning and genetic modification, with Mewtwo as the only successful result. Players theorized that other Pokémon might also be artificial creations, products of scientific tampering rather than natural evolution. Porygon's explicitly artificial origin supported this idea, as did Voltorb and Electrode's resemblance to Pokeballs, suggesting they might be failed experiments in creating living capture devices. The theory proposed that humanity's relationship with Pokémon was more manipulative than the games openly acknowledged, with scientists constantly working to create stronger, more controllable creatures. The Ditto-Mew connection became one of the most widely accepted fan theories, built on several compelling pieces of evidence. Both Pokémon shared identical shiny colorations, a detail that seemed too specific to be coincidental. Both learned Transform, with Ditto's entire moveset consisting solely of that single move. Both weighed exactly the same, despite vastly different body shapes, suggesting shared genetic origin. The theory proposed that Ditto was a failed attempt to clone Mew, with the transformation ability representing incomplete genetic replication that left it able to copy other Pokémon, but unable to maintain its own stable form. This explained why Ditto appeared primarily in locations associated with scientific research, particularly the Pokémon Mansion, where Mewtwo was created. The Ditto theory deepened when players discovered that Ditto could breed with nearly every Pokémon species, another trait it shared only with Mew. The breeding mechanics suggested that Ditto possessed genetic compatibility with the entire Pokémon kingdom, as if it contained fragments of every species' DNA in an unstable mixture. The Mansion journals never mentioned Ditto directly, but they described many failed experiments before Mewtwo's successful creation, leaving room for the theory that Ditto represented those failures, cast aside when they proved unable to match Mew's power. The theory gained additional credibility when later games introduced more artificial Pokémon like Type, Null, and Genesect, showing that genetic engineering was an ongoing practice rather than a one-time experiment. Generation 2 introduced new mysteries that spawned their own theoretical frameworks. The Unown's strange properties and connection to the ruins of Alph suggested they were more than simple Pokémon, perhaps fundamental units of reality that predated or existed outside normal evolutionary processes. Players noted that Unown appeared in 28 forms, matching the Latin alphabet plus punctuation marks, suggesting they were literally the building blocks of language and meaning in the Pokémon world. The ruins' connection to legendary Pokémon and the radio signals that played strange music when Unown were present hinted at ancient civilizations that had harnessed these creatures for purposes the games never fully explained. The Unknown theory expanded to encompass the nature of reality itself within the Pokémon world, proposing that these creatures didn't just represent language, but actually created it, shaping existence through their collective will. The movie, Spell of the Unknown, showed them manifesting a girl's wishes into physical reality, creating an entire fantasy world from her desires and memories. This canonical depiction suggested that Unown possessed reality-warping abilities that went far beyond normal Pokémon powers, placing them in a different category entirely. Theorists connected this to Arceus, the god Pokémon introduced in Generation 4, suggesting that Unown might be fragments of Arceus itself, or tools it used to write reality into existence. The legendary beast's origin story became another focal point for speculation, particularly the canonical destruction of Brass Tower and Ho-Oh's resurrection of 3 unnamed Pokémon into Raikou, Entei, and Suicune. The games never identified which Pokémon species died in the fire, leading to extensive theorizing about their original forms. The most popular theory proposed that they were Flareon, Jolteon, and Vaporeon, the 3 original evolutions that matched the resurrected beast's elemental types. This connection was strengthened by the fact that the beast's designs incorporated features from both feline and canine anatomy, similar to Eevee's ambiguous animal inspiration. The theory suggested that Ho-Oh's resurrection had transformed the evolutions into something greater, creating legendary Pokémon from ordinary ones through divine intervention. Alternative theories about the beast's origin proposed that they represented extinct Pokémon species that no longer existed in the wild, with Ho-Oh preserving them through resurrection rather than creating entirely new forms. This interpretation aligned with the game's themes of preservation and the relationship between humans and nature, suggesting that legendary Pokémon served as guardians of biodiversity. The ambiguity in the game's text allowed both interpretations to coexist, with players choosing the version that resonated most strongly with their understanding of the Pokémon world's metaphysics. The theory became less about finding definitive answers and more about exploring the implications of resurrection, transformation, and the boundaries between life and death. Another detail appears when we look closer at the ghost-type Pokémon and their unsettling Pokédex entries, which spawned theories about the nature of death and the afterlife in the Pokémon world. Yamask explicitly carried a mask that resembled its face from when it was human, with the Pokédex stating that it remembered its former life and sometimes cried when looking at its old face. This confirmed that humans could become Pokémon after death, raising questions about what happened to trainers who died and whether their partners might recognize them in their new forms. Phantom's entry described it as the spirit of a child who died lost in the forest, now inhabiting a tree stump. These entries weren't metaphorical, but straightforward descriptions of how human souls transformed into ghost-type Pokémon. The human-to-Pokémon transformation theory expanded to include other ghost types whose origins seemed too specific to be coincidental. Dreyfloon was said to steal children who grabbed its string-like appendages, with the implication that those children became Dreyfloon themselves in an endless cycle. Litwick and its evolutions drained life force from living beings, with Chandelure's flame supposedly burning with the souls of people it had absorbed. Honej, Doublade, and Aegislash were described as possessed swords that controlled anyone who grabbed their hilts, draining life energy to fuel their own existence. The pattern suggested that ghost-type Pokémon were fundamentally different from other types, existing in a space between life and death that blurred the boundaries between human and Pokémon. The theory raised uncomfortable questions about the ethics of catching and training ghost types, particularly those explicitly described as human souls. Were trainers essentially enslaving the dead, commanding them to battle for sport? Did the Pokémon remember their human lives clearly enough to suffer from their new existence? The games never addressed these implications directly, maintaining the cheerful tone that characterized most Pokémon interactions. Players who engaged with the theory found themselves in territory the games seemed designed to avoid, confronting the darker possibilities that lurked beneath the surface. The ghost-type theory became a way to explore themes of mortality, identity, and transformation that the series touched on but never fully examined. Generation 3 introduced environmental destruction as a central plot element, with Team Magma and Team Aqua attempting to expand land and sea, respectively, through awakening legendary Pokémon. Players theorized that these teams represented different responses to climate change and resource scarcity, with each believing that expanding their preferred environment would solve humanity's problems. The theory positioned the Hoenn region as a society grappling with environmental crisis, unable to find balance between development and conservation. Groudon and Kyogre became symbols of these competing interests, powerful forces that could reshape the world, but whose conflict threatened to destroy it. The player's role in stopping both teams and calming the legendaries represented a third path, one that sought harmony rather than dominance. The Hoenn theory connected to real-world concerns about climate change and resource management, making the game's environmental themes feel more urgent and relevant. The abundance of water, routes in Hoenn took on new meaning as a region already experiencing the consequences of rising sea levels, with Team Magma's goal of creating more land appearing as a desperate attempt to reclaim what had been lost. Team Aqua's complementary goal of increasing ocean coverage suggested either acceptance of the change or belief that adaptation meant embracing water-based existence. The theory reframed the teams as extremists offering different visions of the future, both wrong in their methods, but responding to genuine environmental pressures. Rayquaza's role as the mediator between Groudon and Kyogre supported interpretations of the legendary trio as representing natural balance and the dangers of disrupting it. The theory proposed that the ancient people of Hoenn had once controlled these legendaries to shape the environment, but that civilization had collapsed when the balance was lost, leaving behind ruins and warnings for future generations. The player's journey through ancient Sites and their ultimate confrontation with the awakened legendaries mirrored this historical pattern, suggesting that humanity was doomed to repeat its mistakes unless it learned to coexist with nature rather than dominate it. The environmental theory gave the game's plot a political dimension that resonated with players concerned about real-world ecological issues. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the distortion world introduced in Platinum, a parallel dimension with inverted physics and impossible geometry that existed as Giratina's prison and domain. Players theorized that the distortion world represented antimatter, or a quantum realm existing outside normal space-time, with Giratina as the embodiment of forces that threatened reality's stability. The theory connected to creation myths from Generation 4, where Arceus created Dialga and Palkia to govern time and space, but banished Giratina for its violence. The distortion world became a necessary component of existence, a place where entropy and chaos were contained to prevent them from unraveling the ordered universe that Dialga and Palkia maintained. The distortion world theory explored the metaphysical architecture of the Pokémon universe, suggesting that reality consisted of multiple layers or dimensions with different physical laws. The player's ability to enter and navigate the distortion world implied that the boundaries between dimensions were permeable under certain conditions, and that Giratina could cross between them at will. This raised questions about whether other dimensions existed beyond the ones explicitly shown, and whether other legendary Pokémon might inhabit their own pocket realities. The theory transformed Giratina from a simple counterpart to Dialga and Palkia into a cosmic necessity, the shadow that balanced light and prevented reality from becoming too ordered and static. Theorists connected the distortion world to other dimensional anomalies in the series, including the dream world, ultra space, and the various alternate timelines implied by the existence of parallel universes. The theory proposed that the Pokémon multiverse was far more complex than the games revealed, with countless variations of each region existing across different dimensional branches. This explained inconsistencies between games and media, as they could be depicting different universes rather than contradicting each other. The dimensional theory became a framework for understanding the entire franchise's continuity, allowing multiple canons to coexist without conflict. Generation 5's N and his relationship with Team Plasma sparked theories about his true nature and the source of his ability to understand Pokémon speech. The games revealed that N was raised by Pokémon in isolation, taught to see humans as oppressors who enslaved Pokémon for selfish purposes. Players theorized that N wasn't entirely human, possibly the result of genetic engineering, or a human-Pokémon hybrid created by Getsus to serve as a figurehead for Team Plasma's liberation ideology. His ability to communicate with Pokémon went beyond simple empathy, suggesting a fundamental difference in his neurological or spiritual makeup. The theory positioned N as a bridge between humans and Pokémon, able to see both perspectives but belonging fully to neither world. The N theory examined the ethics of Pokémon training from a perspective the series rarely acknowledged, using N's radicalism to question assumptions that the games usually took for granted. Were Pokémon actually happy in their Pokéballs, or had they simply been conditioned to accept captivity? Did battling truly strengthen the bond between trainer and Pokémon, or was that a justification trainers told themselves to feel better about forcing creatures to fight? N's ideology, while portrayed as misguided in the games, raised questions that couldn't be easily dismissed. The theory suggested that N's extreme position was a necessary corrective to the franchise's uncritical celebration of Pokémon training, forcing players to examine the power dynamics inherent in the system. The revelation that Getzes had manipulated N for his own purposes didn't fully resolve these questions, as it focused on N's exploitation rather than addressing whether his core arguments about Pokémon liberation had merit. Players theorized that the games were intentionally ambiguous on this point, presenting N as both victim and visionary whose ideas were corrupted but not necessarily wrong. The theory positioned Black and White as the franchise's most philosophically sophisticated entry, using N to explore themes of ideology, manipulation, and the difficulty of distinguishing genuine belief from indoctrination. N's story became a meditation on how noble goals could be perverted by those in power, and how questioning established systems required courage, even when that questioning led to uncomfortable conclusions. Another detail appears when we look closer at the ancient civilizations that appeared in ruins throughout the series, particularly AZ and the ultimate weapon from Generation 6. The games revealed that Kalos had been devastated by a war 3,000 years prior, with AZ building a weapon powered by Pokémon life force to end the conflict and resurrect his fallen Floette. Players theorized that this war was the same conflict Lieutenant Surge referenced in Generation 1, suggesting a shared history across regions that connected the entire Pokémon world. The ultimate weapon's existence proved that the war theory had canonical basis, as humanity had indeed weaponized Pokémon on a massive scale. AZ's immortality and eternal wandering served as punishment and reminder of the consequences of using Pokémon as tools of war. The Kalos war theory connected to the Mega Evolution phenomenon, proposing that the radiation from the ultimate weapon had permanently altered Pokémon genetics in ways that enabled temporary transformation into more powerful forms. Mega Stones were concentrated deposits of this radiation, formed in places where the weapon's energy had crystallized over millennia. This explained why Mega Evolution was exclusive to certain species and required both trainer and Pokémon to possess compatible stones, as the transformation relied on resonance with the ancient weapon's energy signature. The theory suggested that Mega Evolution was humanity's attempt to reclaim and control the power that had nearly destroyed civilization, turning a weapon of mass destruction into a tool for personal empowerment. The ethical implications of Mega Evolution became central to the theory, particularly the Pokédex entries describing the physical and psychological toll the transformation took on Pokémon. Several entries mentioned bones breaking, skin tearing, or mental anguish during Mega Evolution, suggesting that the power boost came at a severe cost to the Pokémon's well-being. The theory proposed that Mega Evolution was another form of exploitation, trainers forcing their Pokémon to endure pain for the sake of temporary strength. This connected back to N's arguments about human selfishness, showing that even innovations presented as strengthening the trainer-Pokémon bond could be reframed as cruelty when examined from the Pokémon's perspective. Generation 7's Ultra Beasts and the revelation of parallel dimensions introduced theories about the nature of Pokémon themselves and whether the category Pokémon was even meaningful across different universes. The Ultra Beasts were explicitly from other dimensions, where the rules of physics and biology differed from the main Pokémon world, yet they could be caught in Pokéballs and trained like native species. This suggested that Pokéball technology worked on principles that transcended dimensional boundaries, or that all creatures across the multiverse shared some fundamental property that made them capturable. The theory explored whether being a Pokémon was an intrinsic quality or simply a label humans applied to creatures they could control. The Ultra Beast theory connected to earlier speculation about legendary Pokémon being aliens or extra-dimensional entities, suggesting that many supposedly native species might actually be immigrants from other dimensions. Deoxys's arrival via meteorite and its DNA-based transformation abilities supported this idea, as did Claydol and Baltoy's depiction as ancient constructs that seemed to predate known civilizations. The theory proposed that the Pokémon world's biodiversity resulted from dimensional bleed-through, with creatures from countless realities finding their way into the main dimension and adapting to its conditions. This explained the sheer variety of Pokémon types and the existence of species that defied conventional biological classification. Lucamine's obsession with Ultra Beasts and her fusion with Nihilego raised questions about the boundaries between human and Pokémon, showing that transformation could go both ways under the right circumstances. The theory suggested that the Ultra Wormholes represented cracks in reality where the normal rules didn't apply, allowing radical transformations and impossible combinations. Lucamine's fate demonstrated that humans could become something other than human through exposure to extra-dimensional forces, just as ghost-type Pokémon proved that humans could become Pokémon through death. The dimensional theory encompassed these transformations as evidence that identity was more fluid than the games usually acknowledged. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the time travel elements introduced through Celebi and later expanded with Dialga's temporal powers. Players theorized that multiple timelines existed simultaneously, with each player's journey creating a new branch in the multiverse. This explained inconsistencies between games and allowed for the existence of contradictory events that were all canon in their respective timelines. The theory proposed that legendary Pokémon like Dialga and Celebi could navigate these timelines freely, appearing in multiple eras and dimensions simultaneously. The player character's ability to catch these legendaries suggested that they were uniquely suited to transcend temporal boundaries, perhaps chosen by fate or destiny to play a special role across multiple timelines. The timeline theory gained support from the explicit universe split revealed in Generation 6, where the games divided into a Mega Evolution timeline and a non-Mega Evolution timeline. This confirmed that parallel universes were canonical and that major changes in one timeline didn't affect others. Players theorized that every significant choice in the games created new branches, resulting in countless variations of each region's history. The theory suggested that the anime, manga, and games all depicted different timelines rather than contradicting each other, with each version equally valid in its own dimensional branch. This framework allowed fans to reconcile inconsistencies and accept multiple canons without deciding which was true. The time travel theory connected to speculation about Arceus and its role as creator deity, suggesting that Arceus existed outside time altogether and could perceive all timelines simultaneously. This would explain why Arceus could create Dialga to govern time, as it operated on a level above temporal flow. The theory proposed that legendary Pokémon in general existed in a different relationship to space-time than normal Pokémon, able to influence or transcend it in ways that reflected their domains. Dialga controlled time, Palkia controlled space, Giratina existed outside both, and Arceus encompassed all three as the fundamental ground of existence. Generation 8's Dynamax phenomenon sparked theories about the nature of energy and matter in the Galar region, particularly the revelation that the phenomenon was powered by remains of ancient legendary Pokémon. Players theorized that Dynamax represented a different approach to the same fundamental principle as Mega Evolution, with both phenomena drawing on ancient energy sources, but manifesting in different ways based on regional geology. The Darkest Day and Eternatus's role in creating Dynamax energy suggested that the phenomenon resulted from dimensional intrusion, similar to Ultra Beasts, but with the invading force becoming trapped in Galar rather than simply visiting. The theory positioned Eternatus as a cosmic parasite that fed on Galar's energy while leaking its own alien radiation. The Darkest Day theory connected to broader speculation about catastrophes that shaped each region's history, from Kanto's war to Kalos's ultimate weapon firing to Galar's near destruction by Aeternatus. The pattern suggested that every region had experienced traumatic historical events that left lasting impacts on the landscape and culture. These catastrophes served narrative functions, explaining regional peculiarities and providing backstory for legendary Pokémon, but they also created a darker picture of the Pokémon world as a place of recurring apocalyptic threats. The theory proposed that each new generation's central conflict represented the latest in an ongoing series of existential crises that humanity and Pokémon faced together. The Chairman Rose's plan to trigger the Darkest Day early to prevent an energy crisis raised questions about resource scarcity and sustainability in the Pokémon world. The theory suggested that Dynamax's energy wasn't renewable and that Galar faced genuine resource depletion that Rose was trying to address, albeit through catastrophically misguided means. This environmental theme echoed Hoenn's water versus land conflict and positioned Pokémon games as consistently engaging with ecological concerns. The theory reframed Rose as a well-intentioned extremist rather than a simple villain, someone who recognized a real problem but chose a solution that caused more harm than it prevented. Another detail appears when we look closer at the nature of Pokémon evolution and whether it represents natural development or something more artificial. The fact that many Pokémon only evolved when exposed to specific stones, traded, or taught particular moves suggested that evolution wasn't purely biological, but responded to external stimuli in ways that seemed almost designed. Players theorized that Pokémon evolution was semi-artificial, the result of ancient genetic engineering that programmed species to transform under specific conditions. This would explain why evolution sometimes required items like metal coats or dragon scales, as if Pokémon were machines that needed particular components to upgrade. The evolution theory connected to speculation about Pokéballs and how they stored Pokémon as energy or data. The games showed Pokémon being converted to red light when recalled, suggesting either energy matter conversion or some form of digitization. If Pokémon could be reduced to data, then evolution might represent reprogramming rather than biological development. The theory proposed that the ancient civilization that created Pokéballs had also engineered Pokémon themselves, designing them as companions and workers that could be easily stored and modified. Modern trainers had inherited this technology without fully understanding its origins or implications. The existence of fossil Pokémon supported the artificial evolution theory, as the resurrection process clearly involved genetic reconstruction that might not match the original creature's natural form. The games showed scientists reviving Pokémon from partial DNA samples, filling in gaps with speculation and assumptions. Players theorized that fossil Pokémon weren't accurate recreations of ancient species, but rather modern interpretations, explaining why they seemed so similar to contemporary Pokémon, despite supposedly being extinct. The Galar fossil combination mechanic, where scientists created chimeras from mismatched fossil parts, confirmed that the resurrection process was imprecise at best and actively creating new species at worst. Generation 9's time travel narrative in Scarlet and Violet introduced paradox Pokémon, creatures from the distant past or far future that seemed to violate causality itself. Players theorized that these Pokémon weren't actually from other time periods, but from parallel universes where evolution had taken radically different paths. The paradox forms represented alternate timeline versions of familiar species, showing what they might have become under different environmental pressures. The theory suggested that the time machine didn't travel through time, but across dimensions, pulling variants from realities where the timeline had diverged. This explained why the paradox Pokémon seemed too perfect to be natural, as they were the result of completely different evolutionary histories. The paradox theory connected to speculation about imagination and consciousness creating reality in the Pokémon world, particularly the revelation that the time machine might have been powered by Terapagos and its reality warping abilities. The theory proposed that belief and desire could manifest as physical reality under the right conditions, similar to how Unknown created fantasy worlds from human wishes. The professor's journal entries describing their dreams of discovering ancient or future Pokémon took on new meaning as the force that brought those Pokémon into existence, with the time machine serving as a focus for transforming imagination into matter. This suggested that all legendary Pokémon might be thought forms, creatures that existed because people believed in them strongly enough. The Terrestrial phenomenon and its connection to Terapagos raised questions about the nature of Pokémon typing and whether types represented fundamental properties or merely human classifications. The ability to terrestrialize into any type suggested that typing was more fluid than the games usually portrayed, with Pokémon capable of expressing different type energies depending on circumstances. The theory proposed that types were like quantum states that Pokémon could shift between, with their normal typing representing their most stable configuration. Terrestrialization forced them into specific type states through external energy, overriding their natural inclination. This would explain why some Pokémon could learn moves that didn't match their typing, as they retained latent potential for other type expressions. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the regional variants introduced in Generation 7 and their implications for Pokémon evolution and adaptation. Alolan forms showed familiar species developing completely different traits in response to environmental pressures, sometimes even changing types entirely. Players theorized that these variants evolved far more rapidly than real-world species could, suggesting either that Pokémon evolution operated on different timescales, or that the regional forms were artificially created through selective breeding or genetic modification. The theory proposed that humans had guided the development of regional variants, breeding Pokémon for specific traits that suited local conditions. The regional variant theory connected to speculation about the relationship between humans and Pokémon, suggesting that coevolution had shaped both species over millennia. Humans bred Pokémon to fill particular roles in their societies, while Pokémon adapted to human presence by developing traits that made them more useful or appealing as partners. The theory positioned the current state of Pokémon-human relations as the result of thousands of years of mutual influence, with both species changing each other through their interactions. This explained why Pokémon seemed so well suited to living and working alongside humans, as they had been shaped by that relationship from the beginning. The diversity of regional variants across generations supported interpretations of Pokémon as highly adaptable organisms that could radically alter their biology within relatively short time frames. Galarian Slowpoke's evolution into Slowking through a completely different mechanism than Jotonian Slowpoke suggested that evolution methods themselves could vary regionally, as if the fundamental rules of transformation were location dependent. The theory proposed that each region's unique energy signature or dimensional properties influenced how Pokémon developed, creating a divergent evolutionary paths even for the same base species. This would explain why certain Pokémon could only mega-evolve in specific regions, or why some phenomena like Dynamax were geographically restricted. The origin of humans in the Pokémon world became a subject of intense speculation, particularly given the revelation that humans and Pokémon were once indistinguishable. Sinnoh myths explicitly stated that people in Pokémon had eaten at the same table and been married to each other in ancient times, suggesting either that early humans were a type of Pokémon or that the boundaries between categories were much more permeable. Players theorized that humans descended from a common ancestor with Pokémon, diverging at some point in evolutionary history to become a distinct species that lost its ability to use moves but gained advanced intelligence and tool-making capacity. The human origins theory connected to the presence of humanoid Pokémon species like Machamp, Gardevoir, and Lucario, whose anatomy and behavior seemed designed to mirror human traits. The theory proposed that these species represented the closest living relatives to humans, sharing a more recent common ancestor than other Pokémon. This would explain why they could learn complex behaviors and seemed to possess human-like emotional intelligence, as they retained cognitive abilities that humans also shared. The existence of Pokémon-human hybrids in various stories and legends supported the idea that the genetic distance between humans and certain Pokémon species wasn't as vast as it appeared. The cultural implications of the human-Pokémon connection were profound, as they suggested that the division between trainer and trained was artificial rather than natural. If humans were essentially Pokémon who had lost their powers, then training other Pokémon might be a way of reconnecting with that lost heritage through partnership with creatures that retained the abilities humans had sacrificed. The theory positioned Pokémon training as a symbiotic relationship where humans provided intelligence and strategy, while Pokémon provided power and abilities, creating a whole that neither could achieve alone. This interpretation elevated the trainer-Pokémon bond beyond simple utilitarianism into something approaching spiritual completion. Another detail appears when we look closer at the mysterious character of Looker and his amnesia, which appeared across multiple games and generations without full explanation. Players theorized that Looker was an Ultra Beast in human form, or a human who had traveled between dimensions so many times that his identity had become unstable. His recurring memory loss suggested either traumatic experiences that his mind couldn't process, or side effects of dimensional travel that damaged human consciousness. The theory proposed that Looker represented the cost of investigating threats across universes, with each journey eroding his sense of self until he could barely remember who he was or why he continued his work. The Looker theory connected to broader speculation about the international police and their role in monitoring dimensional anomalies and legendary Pokémon. The organization seemed to possess knowledge about cosmic threats that went beyond normal law enforcement, suggesting either that they were a remnant of ancient civilization or that they had been founded specifically to deal with existential dangers. Looker's appearances during major crisis events in multiple regions implied either incredible luck or some form of precognition that allowed him to position himself where he was needed. The theory suggested that Looker was guided by legendary Pokémon or cosmic forces that recognized him as an important agent in maintaining multiversal stability. The appearance of alternate dimension Looker in Ultra Space, where he had lived for years without aging normally, supported interpretations of him as existing outside normal space-time. The theory proposed that Looker had become unstuck in time through his investigations, experiencing events in non-linear order that left him confused about his own history. This would explain his memory loss as a symptom of temporal displacement rather than simple amnesia, with his mind unable to construct a coherent narrative from fragments experienced out of sequence. Looker became a tragic figure in this reading, sacrificing his own identity and sanity to protect the multiverse from threats that most people never knew existed. The nature of legendary Pokémon and their relationship to concepts like time, space, emotion, and knowledge spawned theories about whether they were truly Pokémon or something else entirely. The creation trio of Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina seemed too powerful and fundamental to be mere creatures, representing as they did the basic structure of reality itself. Players theorized that legendary Pokémon were physical manifestations of abstract principles, thought forms that took on Pokémon-like appearance, because that was how human minds could comprehend them. The theory suggested that Arceus didn't create the universe in the traditional sense, but rather that the universe's existence necessitated Arceus as its personification, with the creation flowing in both directions simultaneously. The legendary theory connected to the late guardians Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, who represented knowledge, emotion, and willpower respectively. These Pokémon seemed to embody psychological concepts rather than physical forces, suggesting that the boundary between mind and matter was more permeable in the Pokémon world. The theory proposed that belief and consciousness played active roles in shaping reality, with legendary Pokémon serving as the interfaces between human thought and physical manifestation. This would explain why legendary Pokémon appeared during times of crisis, as they were responding to collective human need that called them into being or awareness. The contrast between legendary Pokémon that existed in limited numbers versus those that could breed like normal Pokémon raised questions about what made a Pokémon legendary. Mythical Pokémon like Mew and Celebi couldn't breed despite being biological organisms, suggesting either that they were the last of their kind or that their reproduction followed rules different from normal Pokémon. The theory proposed that legendary status was tied to narrative importance rather than biological category, with certain Pokémon designated as legendary because of their role in cosmic events or regional history. This explained why some powerful Pokémon weren't considered legendary, while weaker ones were, as legendary status reflected cultural significance rather than raw power. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the Pokémon Dream World and its connection to consciousness, alternate dimensions, and the nature of reality. The Dream World appeared across multiple games as a space where Pokémon with hidden abilities could be found, suggesting that dreams represented access to potential rather than actual traits. Players theorized that the Dream World was another dimension where probability and possibility existed in superposition, with Pokémon accessing alternate versions of themselves that possessed different abilities. The theory connected this to quantum mechanics and many worlds interpretation, proposing that dreams were windows into parallel timelines where the dreamer's Pokémon had developed differently. The Dream World theory gained support from Pokémon like Darkrai and Cresselia, whose powers explicitly manipulated dreams and nightmares. These legendaries seemed to navigate the boundary between consciousness and reality, able to make dreams manifest in physical form or trap people in nightmare states. The theory suggested that consciousness itself was a dimension that overlapped with physical reality, with dreams representing travel into that psychological space. Pokémon with psychic abilities could navigate this dimension more easily, explaining why psychic types often seemed to possess awareness beyond normal perception. The strange properties of dream-exclusive Pokémon abilities supported interpretations of the dream world as containing potential that couldn't manifest in waking reality due to physical or biological constraints. A Pokémon might possess the genetic potential for multiple abilities, with its actual ability determined by which possibility collapsed into reality when it hatched or was caught. The dream world allowed access to roads not taken, alternate expressions of the same fundamental genetic code. This explained why hidden abilities often seemed contradictory to a Pokémon's normal ability, as they represented different solutions to the same evolutionary pressures. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off. and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. The theory of Pokémon mortality and whether they experienced death differently than humans became particularly relevant when examining ghost-type Pokémon and their explicit origins as departed souls. The games showed that death wasn't an ending, but a transformation, with humans and possibly Pokémon able to continue existing in altered forms. Players theorized that the spirit world was a distinct dimension that souls entered after physical death, with ghost-type Pokémon representing entities that had maintained enough cohesion to interact with the living world. The theory suggested that all beings possessed souls or consciousness that persisted after death, but only some had the strength or will to maintain individual identity in ghost form. The mortality theory connected to the absence of natural death mechanics in the games, where Pokémon fainted rather than died even after sustaining apparently fatal damage. This suggested either that Pokémon were incredibly resilient or that the games abstracted death away to maintain their family-friendly rating. The theory proposed that Pokémon death did occur, but happened primarily outside battle, from old age, disease, or catastrophic injury that exceeded what Pokémon centers could heal. The graveyards shown throughout the series confirmed that Pokémon died, but the games avoided depicting the process directly. This created space for fan theories about what happened to Pokémon after death and whether the afterlife differed from the ghost-type dimension. The concept of Pokémon souls and their relationship to the physical world raised questions about consciousness transfer and whether the process of storing Pokémon in Pokéballs involved separating soul from body. Some theories proposed that Pokéballs captured only the Pokémon's body while its consciousness entered a digital dimension, with the two reuniting when the Pokémon was released. This would explain how Pokémon could be traded electronically, as their consciousness could travel through data networks, while their physical forms remained stored as energy or matter. The theory suggested that Pokémon existed simultaneously in physical and digital spiritual dimensions, with Pokéball technology bridging those realms. Another detail appears when we look closer at the relationship between Pokémon and the environment, particularly the evidence that Pokémon shaped and maintained ecosystems in ways that went beyond normal ecological relationships. Groudon and Kyogre didn't just live in their environments, but actively created them, expanding land and sea respectively. Legendary Pokémon associated with weather, like the bird trio, controlled atmospheric conditions across wide areas. Even common Pokémon demonstrated abilities that seemed designed to maintain ecological balance, with grass types purifying soil and water types regulating moisture. Players theorized that Pokémon served as active agents in planetary management, essentially functioning as tools that Arceus or other cosmic forces used to maintain habitability. The environmental theory proposed that Pokémon weren't simply residents of ecosystems, but their architects and maintenance crews. This explained why Pokémon never seemed to damage their environments, despite possessing destructive abilities, as they were biologically programmed or spiritually compelled to preserve rather than destroy. The theory suggested that the Pokémon world's environment was more stable than Earth's, because Pokémon actively counteracted pollution, climate change, and other destructive processes. Human industrial activities shown in games like Generation 5's Unova region didn't lead to environmental collapse because Pokémon worked constantly to repair the damage. The role of legendary Pokémon in environmental regulation became central to this theory, with creatures like Celebi protecting forests, Lugia calming storms, and Rayquaza maintaining atmospheric balance. These legendaries weren't just powerful Pokémon, but essential components of planetary systems that would fail without their intervention. The theory proposed that ancient humans had recognized this role and built societies around protecting and honoring legendary Pokémon, understanding that their well-being was tied to environmental stability. Modern Pokemon training might represent a degraded form of this ancient partnership, where the original purpose of strengthening Pokemon to better fulfill their environmental roles had been forgotten and replaced with competitive battling. The existence of regional variants and their rapid adaptation to new environments supported the idea that Pokemon were designed to be environmental problem solvers. When Vulpix were brought to snowy Alola, they didn't struggle to survive, but instead evolved ice typing within relatively few generations, suggesting either incredible evolutionary flexibility or active genetic response to environmental need. The theory proposed that Pokemon contained latent genetic programming that activated when they entered new environments, allowing them to fill whatever ecological niche was available. This would explain the vast diversity of Pokemon types and forms, as each represented a different solution to different environmental conditions. The connection between megastones and meteorites introduced theories about extraterrestrial influence on Pokemon evolution and whether life in the Pokemon world originated from space. Deoxys explicitly arrived on a meteorite and possessed the ability to change forms based on its needs, suggesting a level of biological adaptability that seemed impossible without advanced genetic engineering or alien biology. Players theorized that Pokemon weren't native to their world, but had arrived from space, either as intentional colonizers or as accidental immigrants on asteroids and comets. This would explain their incredible diversity and their ability to use energy attacks that seemed to violate thermodynamics, as they evolved under completely different conditions than Earth organisms. The extraterrestrial theory connected to the ultimate weapon in mega evolution, proposing that the ancient Kalos civilization had discovered meteorite-based technology that allowed them to access and weaponize cosmic radiation. The ultimate weapon might have been an attempt to harness the same forces that powered Deoxys and other space-based Pokemon, with mega evolution representing a controlled application of that technology. The theory suggested that humanity had been reverse engineering alien biology for thousands of years, slowly unlocking the secrets that made Pokemon so powerful. This explained why human technology in the Pokemon world was simultaneously advanced and limited, as it was based on partially understood alien science. The presence of Ultra Beasts from other dimensions supported interpretations of Pokémon as a broad category that included any creature capable of being caught in Pokéballs, regardless of origin. If Ultra Beasts counted as Pokémon despite being from different dimensions with different physics, then Pokémon wasn't a biological classification, but a functional one based on compatibility with human technology. The theory proposed that Pokéballs worked by resonating with some fundamental property that all Pokémon shared, perhaps a specific form of consciousness or energy signature. Creatures from across the multiverse could be Pokémon if they possessed this property, making the category far broader than any biological taxonomy could encompass. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the synchronization between trainers and their Pokémon during Mega Evolution, which required emotional bonds strong enough to trigger transformation. This mechanic suggested that consciousness could be shared or linked between species, with trainer and Pokémon essentially becoming a gestalt entity during the evolution. Players theorized that this synchronization represented a temporary merger of souls or minds, allowing both participants to access each other's strength and will. The theory proposed that all successful trainer-Pokemon partnerships involved some degree of this connection, with Mega Evolution simply making it explicit and visible. The synchronization theory connected to speculation about why some people could become Pokemon trainers while others couldn't, suggesting that trainers possessed a special quality that allowed them to bond with Pokémon on a psychic or spiritual level. This might be a genetic trait, a learned skill, or a blessing from legendary Pokémon, but it separated trainers from normal people who could only observe Pokémon rather than command them. The theory explained why protagonist characters consistently succeeded where others failed, as they possessed unusually strong bonding ability that let them connect with multiple Pokémon and even with legendaries that ordinary trainers could never approach. The concept of Pokémon hearing and responding to trainers' hearts during battles suggested that communication between species operated on emotional rather than verbal levels. Trainers didn't need to speak the same language as Pokémon because their bond transcended language, operating through shared feelings and intentions. The theory proposed that experienced Pokémon could anticipate their trainers' strategies without explicit commands, as they learned to read emotional cues and subtle body language. This elevated successful training from simple command and obey relationships to genuine partnerships where both participants contributed equally to strategy and execution. The appearance of Pokémon that could speak human language, like Meowth from the anime, or various psychic types that communicated telepathically, raised questions about whether language barriers were real or simply assumed. The games showed that Pokémon understood human speech even if they couldn't speak it, suggesting that the intelligence gap between humans and Pokémon was smaller than it appeared. Players theorized that Pokémon possessed language-like communication systems among themselves, with calls and cries encoding complex information that humans simply couldn't parse. The existence of Pokémon that mastered human speech proved that they had the cognitive capacity for language, implying that most Pokémon chose not to speak or that species-specific anatomy prevented it. The linguistic theory connected to speculation about N's ability to understand Pokémon speech and whether this was a unique talent or a skill that could be learned. If N could understand Pokémon language through childhood exposure and practice, then the barrier between human and Pokémon communication wasn't fundamental, but cultural and educational. The theory proposed that ancient humans might have commonly understood Pokémon speech, with the ability declining as civilization developed, written language and formal education that didn't include Pokémon linguistics. Modern trainers had lost this skill and relied on emotional bonds rather than true conversation, but the potential for full communication remained dormant in human neurology. The nature of shiny Pokémon and their unusual coloration sparked theories about genetic mutation, alternate dimensions, and the nature of Pokémon biology. The extreme rarity of shiny variants suggested either that they were evolutionary dead ends that couldn't survive in the wild, or that they possessed some special quality that made them spiritually or dimensionally distinct from normal Pokémon. Players theorized that shiny Pokémon were actually from parallel dimensions, where evolutionary pressures had favored different pigmentation, with shininess indicating dimensional displacement rather than simple genetic variation. This would explain why shiny Pokémon were identical to normal variants in all ways except coloration, as they were the same species from slightly different universes, the WoWs. Shiny theory connected to the mysterious shiny charm item and its ability to increase shiny encounter rates, suggesting that dimensional barriers could be weakened or manipulated to allow more cross-dimensional Pokémon to appear. The theory proposed that normal Pokémon encounters drew from a limited set of local dimensions, but the shiny charm expanded the range to include more distant dimensional variations. This would make shiny hunting a form of dimensional fishing, where trainers cast their nets wider through probability manipulation. The fact that breeding could pass shiny status to offspring suggested that the dimensional displacement was inheritable, creating stable bloodlines of dimensionally marked Pokémon. The cultural significance of shiny Pokémon in competitive and trading communities reflected their status as proof of dedication and luck, with hunters spending hundreds of hours searching for specific shiny variants. The obsession with shinies couldn't be explained purely by their rarity, as many rare Pokémon received less attention than common shinies. The theory suggested that shiny Pokémon possess subtle qualities beyond coloration that players unconsciously recognized, perhaps a dimensional resonance that made them feel special even when their practical differences were minimal. This elevated shiny hunting from simple collecting to a spiritual practice of attuning oneself to dimensional variations. Another detail appears similar when we look closer at the Pokémon storage system and its implications for the nature of Pokémon existence. The ability to convert Pokémon into data and store them in digital boxes raised questions about whether Pokémon were truly biological organisms or sophisticated programs that could run on either organic or digital substrates. Players theorized that Pokémon existed simultaneously as physical creatures and digital entities, with the storage system essentially backing up their consciousness to a server while storing their bodies as energy. This would explain how Pokémon could be traded instantaneously across vast distances, as only their data needed to travel, while their physical forms could be reconstructed at the destination. The storage theory connected to speculation about whether Pokémon experienced time while stored in boxes, or whether they entered a suspended state where consciousness paused until release. The games showed that Pokémon didn't age or change while boxed, suggesting either time dilation or complete stasis. The theory proposed that the storage system placed Pokémon in a pocket dimension where time flowed differently or didn't flow at all, preserving them indefinitely without biological degradation. This would make the PC system a form of time travel, with stored Pokémon experiencing no subjective time between storage and release, even if years passed in the outside world. The existence of Porygon and its evolutions, Pokémon that were entirely artificial and existed primarily as programs, blurred the boundary between biological and digital Pokémon. The theory proposed that all Pokémon possessed digital aspects to their existence, with Porygon simply representing the extreme end of a spectrum where most Pokémon were primarily biological with digital components. This would explain how natural Pokémon could be stored as data without losing their living qualities, as they already possessed the necessary digital infrastructure. The theory suggested that Pokéball technology worked by interfacing with these inherent digital properties, converting the biological components to energy while preserving the digital consciousness. The implications of digital Pokémon existence raised philosophical questions about identity and consciousness that the games never fully addressed. If a Pokémon could be perfectly copied as data, could duplicates be made? Were traded Pokémon the same individuals or copies with copied memories? The games treated traded Pokémon as unique individuals with preserved friendship and experience, suggesting that consciousness wasn't simply data that could be duplicated, but involved some quantum or spiritual component that transferred rather than copied. The theory explored these questions through the lens of various consciousness theories, proposing that Pokémon possessed souls or quantum states that gave them continuity of identity even when their physical forms were deconstructed and reconstructed. The role of Rotom in possessing electronic devices introduced theories about the relationship between ghost-type Pokémon and technology. Rotom demonstrated that consciousness could inhabit and control machines, suggesting either that machines possessed a form of proto-consciousness that ghosts could merge with, or that consciousness itself was independent of substrate and could operate in either biological or electronic forms. Players theorized that all technology in the Pokémon world was potentially haunted, as ghost-type Pokémon could theoretically possess any electronic device. The Rotom Dex and Rotom Phone showed that this possession could be beneficial, creating hybrid entities that combined ghost consciousness with machine capabilities. The Rotom theory connected to speculation about the ultimate fate of human consciousness in the Pokémon world, suggesting that death might not mean becoming a ghost-type Pokémon, but rather existing as pure consciousness capable of inhabiting biological, digital, or mechanical forms. This would make the distinction between life and death less absolute, with consciousness persisting indefinitely through various incarnations. The theory proposed that legendary Pokémon like Arceus and Giratina represented this consciousness in its purest form, unbound from any particular physical manifestation and capable of creating bodies as needed. Human souls might aspire to this same transcendence, using ghost-type Pokémon forms as stepping stones toward completely disembodied existence. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the various evil teams across generations and whether their goals revealed genuine problems in the Pokémon world that the games acknowledged but couldn't fully address. Team Rocket's goal of stealing and selling Pokémon pointed to a criminal underground that the games mentioned but rarely showed, suggesting that Pokémon trafficking was common enough to support organized crime. Players theorized that the cheerful surface of Pokémon training masked darker realities, with many Pokémon obtained through theft, smuggling, or breeding mills rather than legitimate catching or purchase. Team Rocket represented this shadow economy, showing that not all human Pokémon relationships were based on mutual respect and partnership. The evil team theory expanded to include Magma and Aqua's environmental extremism, which responded to genuine ecological pressures even though their solutions were destructive. The theory suggested that Hoenn faced real environmental crisis, with land disappearing to rising seas or water becoming scarce due to climate change. The team's willingness to awaken legendary Pokémon and risk global catastrophe indicated desperation born from inadequate responses to these pressures. The player's victory over both teams didn't solve the underlying problems, but simply prevented the most extreme attempted solutions, leaving Hoenn to continue struggling with resource scarcity and environmental degradation. Team Plasma's liberation ideology, despite being revealed as a manipulation by Ghetsis, raised questions that resonated with players who had always felt uncomfortable with certain aspects of Pokémon training. The theory proposed that Plasma's public message contained truth even if their leadership was corrupt, and that Pokémon training did involve exploitation that the games preferred not to examine. The existence of Pokémon kept in boxes indefinitely, never used or loved, but simply collected, supported Plasma's argument that many trainers treated Pokémon as possessions rather than partners. The theory suggested that ethical Pokémon training required constant attention to the creature's well-being and genuine relationships, but that most trainers fell short of these ideals. Team Flare's goal of creating a beautiful world by eliminating everyone who wasn't part of their chosen group revealed elitism and resource hoarding that the theory proposed was endemic to Pokémon society. The ability to own and train Pokémon required resources that not everyone possessed, creating a class system where trainers formed an elite with access to power that ordinary people lacked. Flare represented the logical extreme of this system, where those with resources believed they deserved to control everything and eliminate those without. The theory connected this to real-world inequality, suggesting that the Pokémon games unconsciously reproduced class structures even while presenting a seemingly egalitarian society where anyone could become a trainer. Team Skull's depiction as failed trainers who couldn't complete the island challenge introduced themes of social failure and marginalization that previous games had ignored. The theory proposed that the game's focus on successful trainers obscured the reality that many people tried to become trainers and failed, ending up without career prospects or social status. Skull represented these casualties of the training system, people who had invested everything in becoming trainers but lacked the talent, resources, or support to succeed. The theory suggested that Alola's Island Challenge, while culturally important, created social stratification between those who completed it and those who couldn't, with failed trainers facing stigma and limited opportunities. Another detail appears when we look closer at the breeding mechanics and their implications for Pokémon, reproduction, gender, and the nature of species boundaries. The ability to breed Pokémon across drastically different species within the same egg groups suggested either that Pokémon genetics were far more flexible than real-world biology, or that egg groups represented some essential compatibility that transcended physical form. Players theorized that Pokémon reproduction wasn't truly sexual, but involved some form of genetic exchange that could occur between wildly different species. The theory proposed that Pokémon possessed modular genomes that could be mixed and matched freely, with the offspring inheriting traits from both parents regardless of how incompatible they appeared. The breeding theory connected to the existence of genderless Pokémon that could still reproduce when paired with Ditto, suggesting that Pokémon gender was more about energy polarity or spiritual essence than biological sex. The theory proposed that gendered Pokémon possessed masculine or feminine energy that determined their breeding compatibility, while genderless Pokémon balanced both energies internally and required Ditto's transformative abilities to reproduce. This would explain why some clearly gendered-appearing Pokémon, like Gardevoir, could be either male or female, as their physical form didn't determine their breeding classification. The strange rules around legendary Pokémon breeding, where most couldn't produce eggs even when clearly biological organisms, suggested that legendary status involved more than just rarity or power. The theory proposed that legendary Pokémon existed outside normal reproductive cycles, either sterile by design or reproducing through means the games couldn't or wouldn't depict. Manaphy's ability to produce Phione eggs that couldn't evolve back into Manaphy indicated that some legendaries could reproduce, but their offspring were lesser versions, degraded copies that lacked their parents' full legendary status. This created a distinction between true legendaries that couldn't reproduce and degraded legendaries that could produce offspring but not equals. The breeding mechanics' treatment of regional variants revealed interesting questions about species boundaries and whether variants were the same species or different ones that simply shared a name. The fact that breeding could produce either variant, depending on which parent held an Everstone, suggested that regional differences were epigenetic, controlled by environmental factors that could be preserved or overridden in breeding. The theory proposed that all Pokémon possess genetic potential for multiple forms, with their actual appearance determined by developmental conditions rather than fixed inheritance. This would make regional variants more like morphs than subspecies, capable of reverting to other forms if raised in different environments. The nature of Pokémon eggs and why they appeared fully formed rather than developing gradually raised questions about whether eggs were truly eggs or simply protective cocoons where Pokémon materialized. The instantaneous appearance of eggs at daycares suggested either that Pokémon reproduction occurred far faster than real-world gestation, or that the eggs were created rather than laid, perhaps formed from the parents' combined energy rather than through traditional biological development. The theory proposed that Pokémon reproduction was more magical than biological, with the eggs serving as focusing points where new Pokémon consciousness could manifest in physical form. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the Pokeathlon, contests, musicals, and other non-battle Pokémon activities, and what they revealed about Pokémon intelligence and autonomy. These mechanics showed Pokémon performing complex tasks independently, following choreography, solving puzzles, and demonstrating creativity that suggested consciousness far beyond simple animal intelligence. Players theorized that Pokémon possessed human-level or superior intelligence, but expressed it differently, with their apparent simplicity resulting from communication barriers rather than cognitive limitations. The theory proposed that Pokémon could have built civilizations of their own if not partnered with humans, possessing all necessary mental faculties, but choosing cooperation over independence. The contest theory connected to speculation about what Pokémon did when not actively training or battling, suggesting that they had rich internal lives that the games couldn't fully represent. The existence of Pokémon-only areas in some games, like the Safari Zone or Pal Park, implied that Pokémon were happiest in environments where they could interact freely without human direction. The theory proposed that being caught and trained represented a significant sacrifice for Pokémon, trading freedom for security and purpose. Ethical training required acknowledging this sacrifice and ensuring that Pokémon received sufficient enrichment and autonomy to compensate for their lost independence. The appearance of wild Pokémon societies in various games, from the Slowpoke Well community to the Mareep Ranch to wild Pokémon gathering spots, showed that Pokémon could organize themselves without human intervention. The theory suggested that many Pokémon preferred living independently and only partnered with humans when they found trainers whose goals aligned with their own desires. This reframed catching as a mutual agreement rather than simple capture, with Pokémon choosing to stay with trainers who proved worthy rather than being forced into servitude. The theory explained why some Pokémon were harder to catch than others, as they were more selective about which trainers they would accept. The existence of Pokémon that actively helped humans without being caught, like Chansey in Pokémon Centers or Machoke in construction work, demonstrated that partnership didn't require capture or training. The theory proposed that modern society's emphasis on catching and battling represented only one possible relationship between humans and Pokémon, with many other forms of cooperation existing alongside it. These uncaught working Pokémon suggested a parallel economy where Pokémon contributed to society without being owned, maintaining their autonomy while still benefiting from human association. The theory explored the possibility that this might be a more ethical model than traditional training. The championship system and its role in Pokémon society sparked theories about whether battling served genuine social functions beyond entertainment. The existence of regional champions who seemed to hold quasi-political authority suggested that battle prowess translated into leadership, with champions serving as both celebrities and informal governors. Players theorized that the Pokémon League functioned as a meritocratic proving ground where talent could overcome background, providing social mobility in societies that might otherwise be rigid. The theory proposed that championship served as a safety valve for ambitious individuals, giving them a path to status and influence that didn't require overthrowing existing power structures. The champion theory connected to speculation about why regions needed leagues and whether they served purposes beyond organizing tournaments. The theory suggested that champions acted as defenders against existential threats, with their strength ensuring that regions could respond to legendary Pokémon rampages or invasion from other dimensions. This would explain why champions were often involved in stopping evil teams and protecting legendary Pokémon, as crisis response was part of their unofficial duties. The league system ensured that each region maintained individuals powerful enough to face catastrophic threats, with championships serving as both honor and responsibility. Another detail appears as when we look closer at the various alternate dimensions introduced across the series and whether they represented truly separate universes or different layers of the same reality. The distortion world, dream world, ultra space, and hall of origin seem to occupy different relationships to baseline reality, with some accessible through physical travel and others requiring psychic or spiritual means. Players theorized that the Pokémon multiverse consisted of nested dimensions, each more abstract or fundamental than the one below. The theory proposed a hierarchy from physical reality through dimensional variance to conceptual spaces like the distortion world, to pure potential in the dream world, to the creative source in the hall of origin. The dimensional theory connected to legendary Pokémon and their apparent ability to traverse or exist across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Palkia's control of space suggested it could navigate all spatial dimensions, including those humans couldn't perceive, while Dialga's time manipulation allowed the movement through temporal dimensions. Giratina's reversed world showed that dimensions could have completely different physical laws while still connecting to baseline reality. The theory proposed that legendary Pokémon were naturally multidimensional beings, perceiving and operating across reality layers that ordinary Pokémon and humans experienced as separate or inaccessible. The appearance of alternate dimension versions of familiar characters, particularly in Ultra Space, raised questions about identity and whether dimensional variants were the same people or completely different individuals who happened to share appearance and names. The theory suggested that consciousness might be unique across dimensions, with each variant possessing their own continuity of experience, despite similarities in history and personality. This would make dimensional travel a way of meeting parallel selves who had made different choices or experienced different circumstances, each as valid and real as the original. The theory explored ethical implications of interacting with dimensional variants, particularly whether helping or harming them constituted helping or harming oneself. The concept of a multiverse where every possible choice created new timelines suggested that an infinite number of realities existed, each slightly different from all others. The theory proposed that legendary Pokémon, capable of dimensional travel, could perceive this infinity and navigate it deliberately, while humans and normal Pokémon experienced only their single timeline. This would make legendary Pokémon an effectively omniscient within their sphere of influence, able to see all possible futures and pasts by examining nearby timelines. The theory connected this to prophecy and fate, suggesting that predictions about the future came from legendary Pokémon sharing knowledge of timelines where those futures had already occurred. The preservation of memories across dimensional transitions, as shown by characters who retained knowledge from previous timelines, suggested that consciousness could transcend dimensional boundaries even when physical forms couldn't. The theory proposed that memory existed in a dimension independent of physical reality, accessible across timelines by those with sufficient psychic ability or legendary Pokémon assistance. This would explain how certain characters seemed to remember events that hadn't happened in their timeline, as they were accessing memory traces from dimensional variants who had experienced those events. The theory suggested that déjà vu might be bleeding through of memories from parallel timelines, momentarily accessible before consciousness reoriented to baseline reality. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the technology level in the Pokémon world and why it seemed inconsistent, with some regions possessing advanced computers and holographic systems while still using medieval-style castles and handwritten letters. Players theorized that technological development had followed different paths than in our world, with Pokeball technology and Pokemon power generation making certain innovations unnecessary, while enabling others that would be impossible otherwise. The theory proposed that Pokémon provided such abundant clean energy and labor that Industrial Revolution pressures never developed, allowing society to maintain traditional aesthetics and practices while still advancing in specific areas like genetics and energy manipulation. The technology theory connected to speculation about how Pokémon power was harnessed for human use and whether this constituted exploitation. The games showed electric-type Pokémon generating power for cities and fire types providing heat, suggesting that Pokémon served as living batteries and engines. The theory questioned whether these Pokémon consented to their roles or were simply exploited for their abilities, with their labor taken for granted by societies that had built their infrastructure around Pokémon power. This raised ethical questions similar to those around battling, as even apparently benign uses of Pokémon involved extracting value from creatures whose ability to refuse was questionable. The presence of advanced AI and robotics in some games, particularly the Porygon line and various mechanical Pokémon, suggested that the Pokémon world possessed technological capability matching or exceeding our own in specific domains. The theory proposed that research into artificial Pokémon had driven advances in computing and robotics, with scientists attempting to understand and replicate Pokémon abilities through technology. This would explain why the Pokémon storage system worked despite requiring impossibly advanced data compression and energy matter conversion, as it was reverse engineered from biological Pokémon transformation abilities rather than developed purely through conventional technology. The existence of time machines, dimensional portals, and other physics-defying technology in later games supported interpretations of the Pokémon world as possessing scientific knowledge far beyond contemporary Earth. The theory suggested that this knowledge came from studying legendary Pokémon and trying to replicate their abilities through technology. Dialga's time manipulation inspired time machines, Palkia's spatial control enabled dimensional portals, and Giratina's antimatter properties might have led to exotic energy sources. The theory proposed that legendary Pokémon weren't just powerful creatures, but living proof-of-concept demonstrations for technologies that humans were slowly learning to reproduce artificially. The cultural diversity across regions and its reflection in Pokémon designs sparked theories about human history in the Pokémon world and whether regions represented distinct civilizations or connected cultures with shared origins. The appearance of similar Pokémon across different regions suggested either that Pokémon migration connected all landmasses or that human traders had distributed species globally. Players theorized that an ancient proto-civilization had existed before regional cultures diverged, possessing Pokémon knowledge and technology that was later lost and partially rediscovered. The theory pointed to ruins and ancient artifacts appearing across all regions as evidence of this shared heritage. The ancient civilization theory connected to legendary Pokémon worship and whether modern religions in the Pokémon world descended from literal interactions with gods rather than faith in abstract deities. The games showed temples, priests, and religious practices centered on legendary Pokémon, suggesting that religion was based on tangible, supernatural entities rather than invisible divine forces. The theory proposed that ancient humans had witnessed legendary Pokémon creating and shaping the world, leading to worship practices that honored these beings as gods. Modern religion maintained these practices even as direct contact with legendaries became rare, preserving rituals whose original purposes had been forgotten. The variation in architectural styles across regions, from Kanto's modern Japanese aesthetic to Kalos's European castles to Alola's tropical architecture, suggested that human cultures had developed independently before recent globalization connected them. The theory proposed that each region's isolation had led to unique approaches to living alongside Pokémon, with regional variants developing in response to local training practices and environmental conditions. This would make the Pokémon world's cultural diversity a direct result of its geography, with mountain ranges and oceans creating barriers that allowed distinct traditions to flourish until technology enabled easier long-distance travel. Another detail appears when we look closer at the protagonist's silent nature across all games and whether this represented actual muteness or simply narrative convenience. Players theorized that the protagonist's silence indicated special status, perhaps chosen by a legendary Pokémon or destiny to serve as instruments of fate. The theory suggested that protagonists didn't speak because they were conduits for player will, rather than independent characters existing in a liminal space between being fictional individuals and player avatars. This would explain why they consistently succeeded where others failed and why legendary Pokémon accepted them as trainers, as they were metaphysically different from normal humans in ways the games couldn't explicitly state. The protagonist theory connected to the rival character and why they served as foils, who spoke constantly while the player remained silent. The theory proposed that rivals represented the road not taken, showing what the protagonist might have become if they had developed normally rather than being chosen by destiny. Rivals' eventual growth from antagonists to allies, or even champions, suggested that they achieved greatness through conventional means, while protagonists transcended normal achievement through their special nature. The theory suggested that every protagonist had the potential to become Arceus's chosen champion, wielding legendary Pokémon and shaping history in ways normal trainers couldn't. The appearance of previous protagonists as bonus bosses in some games, particularly Red and Gold and Silver, suggested that these chosen individuals continued to exist in the world even after their stories concluded. The theory proposed that protagonists couldn't return to normal life after their adventures, too changed by their experiences to reintegrate into society. Red's isolation on Mount Silver represented this, showing a former protagonist who had withdrawn from the world after achieving everything it offered. The theory suggested that all protagonists faced the same fate, unable to find purpose in ordinary life after battling gods and saving the world. The rivals' various incarnations across generations, from Gary's arrogance to Silver's abuse-driven hostility to N's ideological opposition, showed different ways that deuteragonists could challenge the protagonist's worldview. The theory proposed that rivals served as necessary shadows to the protagonist's light, embodying doubts and alternatives that the silent protagonist couldn't express. The various evil team leaders could be seen as dark reflections of what protagonists might become if their power was corrupted by selfish goals rather than directed toward helping others. The theory suggested that every antagonist represented a possible future for the protagonist, showing what would happen if their special nature was twisted toward destructive ends. The persistent themes across all Pokémon theories, from death and war to genetic engineering to dimensional travel, revealed a fan base that found deeper meaning in games designed primarily for children. Players who grew up with Pokémon continued engaging with the series as adults, but their interpretations reflected mature concerns that the games themselves avoided addressing directly. The theory landscape became a space where fans explored the implications that official content acknowledged but never fully examined, creating shadow lore that existed alongside but separate from canon. The remarkable consistency of certain theories across decades and generations suggested that they touched something fundamental about the Pokémon world that resonated with players regardless of age or background. The war theory persisted because it explained demographic and cultural details that otherwise seemed arbitrary. The Ditto-Mew connection endured because it made genetic sense and added tragedy to both Pokemon's existence. Ghost-type human origins disturbed because they forced confrontation with mortality in a series that usually avoided mentioning death. These theories succeeded not because they were officially confirmed, but because they illuminated aspects of the Pokemon world that players intuitively sensed but couldn't quite articulate without theoretical frameworks. The community's ongoing creation and refinement of theories demonstrated how fictional worlds could inspire genuine intellectual engagement when they provided sufficient depth and ambiguity. The Pokemon world was detailed enough to feel coherent, but vague enough in crucial areas to leave room for interpretation and speculation. This combination enabled theories to flourish as players filled gaps in official lore with their own narratives and connections. The activity of theorizing became as important as the theories themselves, creating communities built around shared investigation and speculation. The relationship between fan theories and official lore grew more complex as the series progressed, with later games sometimes seeming to acknowledge popular theories without fully confirming them. The appearance of human-like Pokémon, the expansion of dimensional travel, the darkening of Pokédex entries, all could be seen as developers incorporating fan interpretations into official content. The theory landscape influenced the series itself, creating feedback loops where fan speculation shaped future games, which then generated new speculation. This made the boundary between fan creation and official content increasingly permeable, with theories sometimes achieving semi-canonical status through implication, if not explicit confirmation. The evolution of Pokémon theories across generations reflected changes in the fan base's priorities and concerns, from early childhood wonder at simple mysteries to adult examination of ethical and philosophical implications. First-generation theories focused on hidden content and simple mysteries like Mew under the truck or the ghost of Lavender Town. Later theories engaged with complex narrative threads spanning multiple games, examining interconnected lore about ancient civilizations and legendary Pokémon. The shift from what secrets exist to what do these secrets mean marked the maturation of the theorizing community in the series itself. The persistence of theorizing, despite official statements from developers sometimes contradicting popular ideas, showed that theories served purposes beyond simply explaining canon. Players were attached to interpretations that made the Pokémon world richer and more meaningful even when those interpretations weren't officially supported. The death of the rival's Raticate remained compelling regardless of developer intent because it added emotional weight to an otherwise superficial rivalry. The war theory persisted because it contextualized details that seemed random without it. Theories became alternate lenses through which to view the games, valued for the enhanced experience they provided rather than their literal accuracy. The democratic nature of fan theories, where anyone could propose interpretations and the community decided which ones gained traction, created a participatory relationship with the Pokémon world that went beyond passive consumption. Theorizing made fans active contributors to the series' meaning, collaborating to build shadow lore that existed in the collective imagination. This transformed Pokémon from a commercial product into a cultural phenomenon that fans partially owned through their interpretive labor. The theories represented thousands of hours of careful observation, creative speculation, and collaborative refinement that created value beyond what the official games provided. The documentation of theories through forums, wikis, videos, and other media created a permanent record of fan interpretation that future players could access and build upon. Early theories from the late 1990s remained accessible through archived forums and preserved fan sites, allowing new generations to engage with speculations that predated their own involvement with the series. This created theoretical lineages where later ideas built explicitly on earlier foundations, with theorists citing and refining arguments made decades prior. The preservation ensured that theoretical knowledge accumulated, rather than resetting with each generation, building a sophisticated body of interpretive work. The playful acknowledgement of theories by the Pokémon Company through occasional references and winks suggested that developers were aware of and perhaps amused by the elaborate narratives fans constructed. Easter eggs and ambiguous details in newer games could be read as developers leaving breadcrumbs for theorists, encouraging speculation while maintaining plausible deniability. This knowing relationship between creators and fans added another layer to theorizing, as players had to distinguish between intentional hints and coincidental details. The possibility that developers might be deliberately seeding theories made every new game a treasure hunt for clues about hidden narratives. The role of leaks and data mining in theory construction introduced questions about whether theories based on cut content or debug information were legitimate or unfair. Beta Pokémon, unused maps, and abandoned storylines provided evidence for theories about developer intent, but represented possibilities that were explicitly rejected rather than confirmed lore. The theory community debated whether these materials should be considered when building interpretations, with some arguing they revealed true intentions obscured by corporate decisions, while others maintained they were irrelevant to finished games. The debate reflected broader questions about authorial intent and whether canon was determined by developer vision or final product. The intersection between Pokémon theories and real-world science created interesting opportunities for educational content disguised as speculation. Theories about Pokémon genetics, evolution, and ecology often incorporated actual biological concepts, teaching players about natural selection, genetics, and ecosystem dynamics through the lens of fictional creatures. The dimensional theories introduced physics concepts like multiple worlds, interpretation, and relativistic time dilation. These scientific frameworks gave theories additional credibility while making complex real-world concepts more accessible through familiar Pokémon contexts. The emotional investment players demonstrated in defending favored theories showed how interpretive communities formed around shared understandings of fictional worlds. Disagreements about theory validity could become surprisingly heated, with theorists marshaling evidence and attacking opposing positions as if arguing about objective truth rather than interpretations of children's games. This passion reflected the genuine meaning Pokémon held for players who had grown up with the series and continued finding value in it as adults. Theories became personal investments, extensions of individual identity tied to how they understood their favorite games. The philosophical depth that theories added to the Pokémon world elevated games designed primarily for entertainment into texts worthy of serious interpretation and analysis. Questions about consciousness, identity, death, morality, and reality that arose from theorizing matched those explored in canonical science fiction and fantasy literature. The fact that these profound themes emerged from close reading of Pokémon games demonstrated how any sufficiently detailed fictional world could support sophisticated interpretation regardless of its intended audience. The theories proved that depth existed in the Pokémon world for those willing to look carefully and think critically about what they found. As we drift toward the end of this journey through decades of Pokémon, speculation, and interpretation, we see that theories ultimately served to deepen engagement with games that meant something important to players who grew up exploring their worlds. Each theory represented an attempt to make sense of details that seemed significant, to find connections that suggested intentional design rather than arbitrary choices. Whether theories were true in any official sense mattered less than the enrichment they provided, the additional layers of meaning that transformed simple monster-catching games into complex narratives about war, death, identity, and the nature of existence itself. The collaborative nature of theory building created communities united by shared curiosity and willingness to look beneath the surface of official narratives. These communities persisted across decades, welcoming new members while preserving institutional knowledge from earlier eras. The passing down of theories from older fans to newer ones ensured continuity of interpretation, even as the games themselves evolved and changed. Theories became tradition, shared stories that connected players across generations and created common ground for discussion and speculation. The Pokémon theory landscape remains vibrant and active, with each new game release generating fresh speculation and re-examination of older theories in light of new information. The process never truly concludes as long as new content continues appearing and players continue finding connections between scattered details. The living nature of theoretical interpretation ensures that the Pokémon world never becomes static or fully understood, always containing mysteries waiting to be uncovered and connections waiting to be made. This ongoing discovery keeps players engaged long after they've completed the game's official content, providing infinite replay value through new interpretive lenses. The legacy of Pokémon theories extends beyond the franchise itself to influence how fans approach other media and fictional worlds. Players who learned to theorize about Pokémon carried those skills to other series, looking for hidden depths and subtle connections wherever they found them. The practice of close reading, evidence gathering, and collaborative interpretation that Pokémon theories encouraged transferred to broader media literacy and critical thinking. The theories taught a generation of players to question surface narratives and search for deeper meaning, skills valuable far beyond gaming. And that is all for today's theories. We will now review the past theories you may have missed. In the first episode, a young trainer receives his starter and ventures into tall grass for the first time. Within minutes, he angers a flock of avian, creatures that pursue him relentlessly, cornering him near a waterfall as storm clouds gather overhead. His electric companion unleashes a massive discharge that lights up the sky, knocking both the birds and the trainer unconscious. The theory suggests that this moment marks not a beginning, but an ending. The electrical surge, combined with the physical trauma of the attack, places the trainer in a comatose state from which he never truly awakens. Every adventure that follows exists only within his mind, a dream constructed by a brain trying to make sense of fragmented consciousness. The unchanging age of the protagonist becomes evidence, remaining perpetually 10 years old across regions and seasons. Time moves forward in the world around him, but he remains frozen at the moment of injury, his perception locked into the age he was when the incident occurred. The legendary creature's appearance takes on new meaning under this interpretation. Rather than a miraculous encounter with a rare being, it becomes a dying brain's attempt to create hope and meaning. The vision of something magnificent and impossible serves as the foundation for the elaborate fantasy that unfolds, a coping mechanism for consciousness trapped between life and death. Each new region explored represents deeper layers of the coma dream, the mind constructing increasingly complex scenarios as it retreats further from waking reality. Supporting evidence appears in the protagonist's impossible resilience. He survives situations that should hospitalize or kill him, falling from great heights, enduring attacks from powerful creatures, and recovering immediately without lasting injury. In a comatose state, The dreaming mind eliminates consequences, creating a world where danger exists but never truly threatens. The pattern repeats across hundreds of episodes, establishing a consistency that feels less like plot armor and more like the rules of a constructed reality. The companions who join and leave the protagonist's journey could represent fragments of his consciousness. Each friend embodies different aspects of personality, desires he held before the accident, or people he encountered briefly in his short waking life. They appear, travel alongside him for a time, then depart when their symbolic purpose concludes. The rotation of traveling partners mirrors the way dreams shift focus, introducing and removing elements as the subconscious explores different emotional landscapes. Critics of the theory point to its darkness, arguing that a franchise aimed at children would never embrace such a grim foundation. The official narrative presents the ageless protagonist as a stylistic choice, allowing young viewers to identify with a character who remains their peer regardless of when they discover the series. The lack of aging serves practical storytelling purposes, maintaining status quo and preventing the complications that would arise from a maturing protagonist. Yet, the theory persists because it addresses questions the official narrative leaves unanswered. Why does time affect everyone except the protagonist? Why do his adventures follow dreamlike logic, where coincidences pile up and consequences vanish? Why does returning home never hold appeal, as if some part of him knows that place no longer truly exists? The coma interpretation provides answers, even if they're answers no one truly wants. Another creature has sparked decades of speculation about its original intended status. Early episodes of the animated series featured background art showing portraits of legendary beings, avian creatures representing elemental forces. Alongside these confirmed legendaries appeared another figure, a canine form with flowing mane and noble bearing. This fourth portrait suggested a creature of equal importance, yet it never received legendary treatment in the final games. The creature's official Pokédex classification describes it as legendary, despite being obtainable through normal evolution and appearing in multiple trainer teams. This contradiction fuels speculation about last-minute design changes. The creature's pre-evolution requires a special stone to trigger transformation, a method associated with common species rather than unique legendary beings. Yet its appearance, its lore, and its statistical distribution suggest something more significant was intended. Design documents from early development reportedly showed different legendary configurations. The trio of elemental birds initially lacked a fire representative, with the canine filling that role. Later revisions introduced a proper avian fire type, pushing the canine into regular species status. The remnants of its legendary origins remained embedded in the code, creating the contradictions players noticed decades later. The creature's design draws from guardian lions in Asian mythology, protective deities that ward off evil spirits and bring fortune to those they favor. This mythological basis aligns perfectly with legendary status, grounding the creature in the same cultural traditions that inspired other legendary beings. The disconnect between its mythological inspiration and its in-game rarity creates cognitive dissonance that the theory seeks to resolve. Regional variations in how trainers view the creature support the legendary theory. In some areas, it's treated as a rare and revered species appearing in positions of honor and respect. Elite trainers favor it, despite its technical non-legendary status, as if acknowledging an unspoken truth about its nature. The creature's presence in important battles and ceremonial contexts elevates it beyond its official classification. Physical evidence exists in the background art of various Pokémon centers, or engravings and murals group it with confirmed legendary creatures. These artistic choices could represent animator error, or they could be holdovers from earlier story drafts where the canine held legendary status. The consistency of these background details across multiple episodes suggests intentional design rather than repeated mistakes. Abilities and statistics place the creature in an unusual position, stronger than most regular species, but not quite reaching legendary thresholds. This middle ground could represent compromise, an attempt to preserve some of the creature's intended power while removing its legendary designation. The result is a species that feels important without being irreplaceable, unique without being unobtainable. The evolution requirement adds another layer of strangeness. Legendary creatures traditionally don't evolve, existing as singular, perfect forms. Giving the canine a pre-evolution contradicts legendary design philosophy, yet the evolution itself requires a special stone, maintaining some of the rarity and ceremony associated with legendary transformations. The mixed signals reinforce the idea of a creature caught between two roles. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, we encounter theories surrounding a creature that wears the skull of its deceased mother. This dark backstory appears directly in official sources, yet questions remain about the logistics and implications. If every member of the species wears its mother's skull, where do the skulls come from? Do mothers die giving birth, creating an eternal cycle of sacrifice? Or does the species' life cycle involve some other tragic mechanism? The skull itself shows no growth or change as the creature matures, remaining the same size from infancy through evolution. This unchanging nature suggests the skull isn't biological bone, but something else entirely, a constructed object or a manifestation of grief made tangible. Perhaps the skull represents trauma given physical form, the creature's sorrow creating a psychic shell that it cannot remove. Connection theories attempt to link this creature to others through shared biology or tragic origin. One prominent theory suggests it's the orphaned offspring of a different species, a fire type whose mother died during a specific event. The theory relies on visual similarities and overlapping habitats, proposing that when the mother dies, the offspring undergoes a transformation driven by grief and isolation. The skull it wears comes from its own mother, and the trauma of loss fundamentally changes the creature's type and nature. Evidence for this connection appears thin under scrutiny. The species in question have different body structures, different egg groups, and no official evolutionary relationship. The theory requires accepting that grief alone can alter a creature's fundamental biology, changing its type and form completely. While the Pokémon world contains transformations driven by emotion and environment, none operate on quite this scale. Alternative explanations suggest the skull is passed down culturally rather than biologically. Young creatures receive skulls from elders in ceremonial fashion, creating a tradition that honors the deceased while providing protection. This cultural interpretation removes the biological impossibility of every mother dying, but raises questions about where the first skull originated and why the practice began. The creature's Pokédex entries emphasize loneliness and longing, describing how it cries at night while thinking of its lost mother. These entries never clarify whether the mother is dead or simply absent, leaving room for interpretations less dark than the death theory. Perhaps the species naturally separates from parents at birth, and the skull represents a symbolic rather than literal connection to heritage. Some entries mention that the creature's tears have value, sought after by collectors or used in traditional medicine. This detail adds another disturbing layer, suggesting that humans exploit the creature's grief for profit. The ethics of capturing and keeping a creature defined by mourning become questionable, yet the games never address this moral dimension. Evolution brings changes to the skull, which fuses with the creature's body and transforms into armor-like protection. This integration suggests the skull isn't simply worn, but becomes part of the creature's biology over time. The boundary between tool and body blurs, making the skull less like clothing and more like a parasitic growth that the creature cannot remove even if it wished to. The evolution's appearance grows more aggressive and militant, as if grief has hardened into rage. The bone becomes a weapon as well as armor, used to strike opponents and defend territory. This transformation from mourning child to bitter warrior completes a tragic arc, showing how unprocessed grief can twist creatures into something far from their original gentle nature. Different theories propose different parent species, each trying to solve the skull mystery through genetic connection. None fit perfectly, and none are confirmed by official sources. The skull's origin remains deliberately ambiguous, allowing the tragedy to persist without requiring logical explanation. Sometimes the horror lies in not knowing and accepting that some questions have no comfortable answers. Another dark theory explores what happens inside the devices used to store and transport creatures. Official explanations remain vague, describing energy conversion and comfortable environments without providing specific details. This vagueness invites speculation about whether the creatures remain conscious, whether they experience time, and whether the conversion process causes pain or trauma. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. The technology works instantly from an external perspective, creatures vanishing in a flash of light and reappearing just as quickly. But subjective experience inside might differ completely from observed time. Seconds outside could feel like hours or years inside, or time might not exist at all in the converted state. The creatures never show signs of temporal disorientation upon release, but they also never discuss the experience. Energy conversion raises philosophical questions about continuity of consciousness. If a creature is broken down into energy and reconstructed, is it the same individual or a copy? Does the original consciousness end each time, with a new one beginning when the creature materializes? The games treat captured creatures as continuous individuals with consistent memories and personalities, but the actual mechanics might tell a different story. Some Pokédex entries mention creatures that hide inside storage devices willingly, treating the internal space as comfortable shelter. These entries suggest consciousness persists in the converted state, with creatures aware of their surroundings and capable of choosing when to emerge. Other entries contradict this, describing creatures as sleeping or dormant during storage. The inconsistency leaves room for darker interpretations. The devices can store creatures indefinitely without apparent ill effects. No food, water, or other biological needs require attention while stored. This suggests either that biological processes halt completely during storage, or that the internal environment somehow provides for needs without external input. The former option implies a kind of death and resurrection with each use, while the latter requires technology far beyond anything else seen in the world. Malfunctions and accidents involving storage devices appear rarely in the series, but when they occur, the results range from harmless to catastrophic. Creatures released at wrong locations, creatures scrambled with others, creatures that won't materialize properly. Each incident hints at the technology's potential for disaster. The rarity of these accidents suggests robust safety systems, but it also highlights the dangers inherent in reducing living beings to stored energy. Criminal organizations sometimes use modified storage devices as weapons, forcibly capturing trained creatures and preventing their release. These devices override the normal consent-based capture system, raising questions about what protections, if any, exist against technological abuse. If the devices can be modified for crime, what stops more sinister applications like permanent imprisonment or forced modification? The invention and spread of storage technology happened relatively recently in the world's timeline within living memory of elderly characters. Before this technology, humans and creatures coexisted through different methods, with training taking forms that didn't involve regular capture and storage. The rapid adoption of storage devices suggests they filled a crucial need, but it also means the long-term effects remain unknown. Creatures in the wild show no fear of the devices, not fleeing, when trainers prepare to throw them. This comfort implies either that the capture process isn't traumatic, or that creatures lack understanding of what's about to happen. Post-capture, creatures show varying attitudes toward their trainers, some bonding closely, while others remain distant. Whether the capture experience itself influences these relationships remains unclear. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, we encounter theories about artificial life created through human experimentation. One particular creature represents the clearest example of ethical boundaries crossed in pursuit of power. According to official sources, scientists worked for years to create the most powerful creature possible, using genetic material from a rare mythical being. The project succeeded in creating life, but that life came with consciousness, personality, and questions about its own existence. The laboratory where creation occurred was destroyed, with entries suggesting the created being rebelled against its makers. The violence implied in these entries raises questions about what happened during those final moments. Did the creature kill its creators intentionally, or were the deaths accidental results of confusion and fear? The games never provide clear answers, leaving players to imagine the scene. The destroyed laboratory can be visited in some versions, its ruined halls containing journal entries that track the project's progression. Early entries show scientific excitement and curiosity, researchers amazed by their success in creating life from genetic material. Later entries grow more troubled, noting unexpected developments in the creature's behavior and intelligence. The final entries drip with fear and regret, scientists realizing too late that they've created something they cannot control. One entry mentions the creature showing signs of intelligence far beyond expectations, attempting to communicate and expressing confusion about its existence. This consciousness makes the ethical violation clear. They created a thinking, feeling being without considering what obligations they owed to their creation. The creature's questions about its purpose and origin receive no satisfying answers, because the scientists themselves don't have answers beyond we wanted to create power. The creature escapes containment and hides in a distant cave, the deepest part of the region's most dangerous location. This self-imposed exile suggests awareness of its own dangerous nature and desire to avoid harming others. It waits in darkness, alone, with questions about identity and purpose that will likely never receive answers. Players can capture it, but the games never address whether this imprisonment provides comfort or compounds the creature's isolation. Different media present the creature's story with varying levels of darkness. In some versions, it seeks understanding and connection, hoping to find purpose beyond the violence it's capable of. In others, it embraces its role as the ultimate weapon, testing itself against strong opponents to prove its supremacy. These contradicting portrayals might represent different individuals, or they might show different aspects of the same confused consciousness. The creature's appearance reflects its artificial origin, with features that seem designed rather than evolved. Its body follows no natural evolutionary logic, instead combining elements chosen for maximum battle effectiveness. This artificial aesthetic makes it impossible to forget what it is, a constructed being rather than a natural one, forever marked by its origin. Questions persist about whether other laboratories attempted similar projects. One creature suggests a whole species, but what if others existed that simply weren't as successful or survived? Failed experiments might remain hidden in abandoned facilities, mistakes locked away because admitting them would expose the ethical violations involved in the project. The mythical creature whose genetics were used raises its own questions. How was genetic material obtained from a being so rare that most scientists don't believe it exists? Did the creature consent, or was material taken without permission? The implications of stealing genetic material from an intelligent being for experimentation grow darker the more one considers them. Some theories suggest the created creature isn't unique, that it's merely the only successful result of many attempts. Other failed creations might have died, never achieving stable form. The journals never mention failed attempts, but absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. The scientists might have simply chosen not to document their failures, especially if those failures involved suffering. Modern incarnations of the story sometimes soften the darkness, presenting the creature as misunderstood rather than dangerous, seeking connection rather than isolation. These retellings sand away the sharp edges of the original narrative, making the story more palatable for younger audiences. But the original darkness remains in the code, in those journal entries, and that destroyed laboratory. Another theory explores whether certain creature types should exist at all, whether their presence represents natural evolution or something more sinister. Ghost-type creatures in particular raise questions about the nature of death and consciousness in the Pokémon world. Some ghost types are described as literally being dead, spirits of deceased beings that continue to exist in altered form. If ghosts exist as confirmed by these creatures, what does that mean for human death? Do human spirits persist after death in similar fashion, or do creatures and humans experience different afterlives? The games avoid addressing human death directly, but the existence of ghost creatures implies something survives physical death, at least for some species. Certain ghost-type creatures are explicitly described as the spirits of people who died under specific circumstances. One wears a mask that resembles its face from when it was human, carrying the object that connects it to lost humanity. Another type forms from the spirits of children who died lost in forests, becoming protective guardians of those same woods. These direct statements about human to creature transformation establish that the boundary between human and creature might be less fixed than assumed. The process of becoming a ghost-type creature remains unexplained. Not all deaths produce ghosts, suggesting specific circumstances or conditions must be met. Perhaps strong emotion at moment of death, perhaps unfinished business, perhaps simple chance. The randomness makes death more frightening, not knowing whether consciousness will end or continue in altered form. Some ghost creatures are born rather than made, eggs producing species that are categorically ghost-type from birth. This raises questions about their nature. If they're born as ghosts, are they truly ghosts, or is that simply their type classification? The distinction between species and spiritual state blurs in ways the games never fully clarify. Possession features prominently in several ghost-type evolutionary lines. Creatures attach themselves to objects, using them as anchors or homes. Objects become extensions of the ghost, animated by their presence. In some cases, possession appears consensual or at least neutral, but other cases describe creatures forcibly inhabiting objects and attacking those who disturb them. One evolutionary line consists of spirits possessing swords. The possessed weapons drain life force from those who touch them, using the stolen energy to grow stronger. The progression from single sword to dual swords to sword and shield formation suggests the spirit grows in power and complexity through continued possession. These creatures exist as willing tools of destruction, forged weapons given terrible purpose. Another ghost creature freezes its victims and collects them, creating galleries of ice sculptures from people it finds attractive. The predatory nature of this behavior gets glossed over in child-friendly media, but the Pokédex entries spell out the horror clearly. This creature hunts and kills, driven by warped aesthetic preference. Cultural attitudes toward ghost types vary within the game world. Some regions revere them as connections to ancestors in the spiritual realm. Other regions fear them as omens of death and misfortune. Trainers who specialize in ghost types are often portrayed as mysterious or unsettling, marked by their association with death and the supernatural. The existence of ghost types complicates the nature of creature death in battle. When a creature faints in battle, it's consistently framed as unconscious rather than dead. But if death produces ghosts, and no ghost types spontaneously appear from fainted creatures, what does that suggest about the nature of fainting? Perhaps creatures can't truly die in battle, protected by some mechanism the games never explain. Or perhaps the distinction between fainting and death is maintained so carefully, specifically, to avoid the ethical implications of battle deaths. Ghost types themselves can faint in battle, raising the question of whether they can die a second time. If they're already dead, what happens when they're defeated? Do they dissipate permanently, or do they simply lose form temporarily, like living creatures lose consciousness? The games treat them mechanically, identically to other types, avoiding the philosophical questions their existence raises. Some ghost creatures are described as eating emotions, feeding on fear or sadness or anger. This predation on psychological states rather than physical sustenance marks them as fundamentally different from living creatures. They exist in a space between physical and spiritual, requiring no traditional food, but still possessing hunger. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, we encounter theories about legendary creatures and their relationship with humanity. These powerful beings often possess world-shaping capabilities, controlling fundamental forces like time, space, land, sea, or sky. The games present them as protectors or guardians, but their power creates potential for catastrophic destruction. Several legendaries are explicitly stated to have the power to destroy the world, either directly through their strength or indirectly by upsetting cosmic balance. One controls time itself, another controls space. If these beings fought seriously, reality could unravel. The games never explore what safeguards, if any, prevent these entities from exercising their full destructive potential. Ancient legends describe wars between legendary creatures, battles that reshaped continents and altered climate permanently. These conflicts left scars still visible in the geography, canyons, and mountains formed by clashing titans. If such battles happened before, they could happen again, with modern civilization caught in the crossfire. Certain legendary creatures appear in myths about creating the world itself. Genesis figures responsible for land, ocean, or sky. These creation myths raise questions about whether the legends are literal truth or cultural storytelling. If literal, these creatures predate everything else, existing outside normal time and possessing perspective alien to mortal consciousness. The relationship between legendaries and humanity varies dramatically. Some actively assist humans, protecting them from threats or granting wishes. Others remain distant, observing humanity with detachment or indifference. A few actively resent humanity, viewing human expansion and technology as threats to the natural world they embody. Criminal organizations repeatedly attempt to capture and control legendary creatures, seeking to use their power for various schemes. The ease with which these organizations locate legendaries suggests the creatures' hiding places aren't particularly well concealed. The repeated failures of these schemes create a false sense of security. But what if an attempt succeeded? What if someone with competent planning and resources managed to control a being capable of reshaping reality? Some legendaries are described as sleeping for centuries or millennia, awakening only during specific astronomical events or moments of crisis. These sleeping giants represent ticking time bombs, threats that could emerge without warning if disturbed or woken prematurely. Human expansion into wild areas increases the likelihood of accidentally disturbing sleeping legendaries, a risk no one in the games seems particularly concerned about. Certain legends mention sealing away dangerous creatures, imprisonment rather than defeat, when the threat couldn't be eliminated. The seals require specific conditions to maintain, and if those conditions lapse, the imprisoned beings will escape. The games sometimes task players with preventing these releases, but the ease with which seals can be broken suggests they're barely adequate restraints. Legendary creatures sometimes have the power to resurrect the dead, bringing creatures or even humans back to life after fatal events. This power appears limited and controlled, used only in specific circumstances rather than freely available. The criteria for who or what deserves a resurrection remain unclear, seemingly arbitrary from human perspective. The sheer number of legendary creatures undermines their legendary status. If dozens of unique, impossibly powerful beings exist across various regions, are they truly legendary? Perhaps legendary in this context means something different than in human terminology, referring to specific categories of power level or origin rather than uniqueness or rarity. Some theories propose that legendary creatures aren't biological at all, but rather conscious manifestations of natural forces. They exist because the concepts they embody exist, and they couldn't die because the forces they represent can't die. Under this interpretation, capturing a legendary doesn't imprison a living being, but rather temporarily binds a force of nature to human will. Contradictions in legendary lore suggest either different cultures interpreting the same creatures differently, or multiple individuals of supposedly unique species. The games acknowledge that some legendaries have multiple individuals, but others are treated as singular, unique entities. The inconsistency makes establishing any firm truth about their nature difficult. Dark theories suggest that legendary creatures view humanity as an infestation to be managed rather than partners to be protected. From their perspective, humans are destructive parasites that breed rapidly and consume resources. The only reason they haven't eliminated humanity is either because they lack the capability or because some cosmic rule prevents direct intervention. Another perspective suggests legendaries are products of human belief given form. If enough people believe in something, it becomes real in the Pokémon world. The creatures we call legendary might be thought forms created by ancient civilizations, given power by collective faith. This would explain their connection to human culture and their tendency to appear during crises they manifest when belief in them peaks. The relationship between legendaries and regular creatures remains undefined. Are legendaries simply extraordinarily powerful members of species that also exist in weaker forms? Are they unique beings created through different processes? The games avoid providing clear answers, maintaining mystery around their origins. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, we encounter theories about the technological infrastructure of the Pokémon world and whether it harbors hidden dangers. The storage system, which allows creatures to be transferred digitally across vast distances, represents technology far beyond contemporary human capability. This raises questions about who developed it and what else that level of technology could achieve. The storage system operates through a network maintained by a single individual, in some games, a scientist whose name becomes synonymous with digital storage. This centralization creates vulnerability. If the system goes down, millions of creatures could be trapped in digital limbo. The games never explore what safeguards exist against system failure or what would happen to stored creatures if the network collapsed. Digital creatures that exist purely as data represent another concerning development. These artificial life forms are created entirely through programming, complex code given consciousness and form. They possess no biological body, existing only as information that can be copied, modified, or deleted. The ethical implications of creating conscious, digital life go completely unaddressed. One digital creature develops the ability to travel through cyberspace freely, entering computer systems and potentially accessing any networked device. This ability makes it simultaneously the ultimate tool and ultimate threat, capable of shutting down infrastructure or stealing information on massive scale. The games are presented as friendly and helpful, but the potential for misuse is staggering. Attempts to create physical bodies for digital creatures produce mixed results. Some transitions succeed smoothly, digital consciousness adapting to biological form. Others produce creatures caught between states, neither fully digital nor fully physical. These in-between beings sometimes demonstrate instability, glitching or malfunctioning in ways that suggest profound discomfort or pain. The technology used to heal creatures at dedicated centers operates on similar principles to storage devices, scanning and repairing damage at cellular or possibly subatomic level. This medical technology seems impossibly advanced compared to human medicine in the same world. Humans suffer from diseases and injuries that the creature healing machines could theoretically cure, yet the technology remains specialized for creatures only. Some theories suggest the healing machines don't actually repair damage, but rather restore creatures to their most recently stored pattern. Under this interpretation, creatures that visit centers regularly are essentially being reset to that pattern, losing any natural development or change that occurred since. This would explain the instantaneous healing, but raises disturbing questions about continuity and identity. Cloning technology exists and has been successfully used to resurrect extinct creatures from preserved genetic material. The process works reliably enough to be commercialized, with multiple facilities offering resurrection services. Yet ethical discussions about cloning appear nowhere in the games, with resurrection treated as purely beneficial with no potential downsides. The resurrection process raises questions about whether revived creatures are truly the same individuals that existed millions of years ago, or entirely new beings with ancient genetics. Do they remember their original existence, or are they blank slates wearing ancient skin? The games present them as identical to their original counterparts, but the philosophical questions remain unanswered. Some creatures are explicitly stated to be genetic experiments, hybrids, or modifications created through deliberate manipulation. These experiments produce creatures with unusual type combinations or abilities not found in natural populations. The casual acceptance of genetic engineering suggests a society with few ethical qualms about modifying life at fundamental levels. failed experiments presumably exist alongside successful ones, creatures that didn't develop as planned or suffered unforeseen complications. These failures never appear in games, but absence doesn't mean non-existence. Labs conducting cutting-edge genetic research must produce failures, and the question becomes what happens to those failures. Virtual reality and simulation technology appears in some games, advanced enough to create fully immersive artificial worlds. Characters can enter these simulations and experience them as real, raising questions about how one distinguishes between simulation and reality. If virtual worlds feel completely real, do they become morally equivalent to physical reality? Some creatures naturally possess psychic powers strong enough to create illusions indistinguishable from reality. A sufficiently powerful psychic creature could trap someone in a personal illusion indefinitely, creating an entire false world in their mind. The victim would never know they weren't experiencing reality, making this a form of imprisonment more complete than any physical cage. Mind reading and mind control abilities appear frequently among psychic creatures, presented as normal type abilities rather than horrifying violations of mental autonomy. A creature that can read thoughts has access to every private thought, every secret, every moment of shame or weakness. A creature that can control minds can override free will entirely, turning people into puppets. The games never explore the trauma of having one's mind read or controlled, treating these abilities as minor battle tactics rather than profound violations. Characters who experience psychic intrusion show no lasting effects, presumably recovering completely once the effect ends. This casual treatment of mental manipulation suggests either that such experiences truly leave no lasting harm in this world, or that society has simply normalized them to the point where trauma is ignored. Certain creatures can manipulate time, either speeding it up, slowing it down, or jumping forward and backward along the timeline. These abilities allow for paradoxes, situations where cause and effect become circular or self-referential. The games never explore what prevents timeline corruption or whether alternate timelines branch off from time manipulation events. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, we encounter theories about the relationship between humans and creatures, questioning whether that relationship is as mutually beneficial as presented. The capture system involves throwing containment devices at wild creatures, attempting to subdue and claim them. From the creature's perspective, this is unprovoked assault followed by imprisonment. The games use the word tame instead of caught, but the mechanism involves forcible capture rather than willing partnership. Creatures don't consent to being captured, they're simply defeated and stored. The post-capture relationship might develop into genuine friendship, but it begins with violation of autonomy. Wild creatures attempting to live freely are treated as resources to be harvested, with trainers cutting through their habitats and capturing dozens or hundreds for various purposes. The ecological impact of removing so many creatures from wild populations goes completely unexplored. How do ecosystems remain stable when trainers constantly extract creatures? The breeding system treats creatures as livestock, paired with chosen partners to produce eggs that the trainer claims immediately after hatching. Newborns never know their parents, raised instead by trainers who view them as property to be traded or released based on their competitive viability. The system would be considered deeply unethical if applied to humans, but it's completely normalized for creatures. Some trainers release creatures after catching them deemed unsuitable for their purposes. These released creatures must either find their way back to their original habitats or adapt to wherever they're abandoned. The games never explore what happens to released creatures or how abandonment affects them psychologically. Competitive battling involves creatures fighting under human direction, sustaining injuries that would be considered animal abuse if applied to actual animals. The games justify this through creature consent and enjoyment of battle, but the consent is assumed rather than demonstrated. Do creatures actually want to fight, or have they simply been conditioned to accept it? The evolution of certain creatures requires them to faint multiple times, accumulating specific amounts of battle damage before transformation triggers. This requirement explicitly demands suffering as prerequisite for development, a disturbing condition that suggests these creatures' biology evolved specifically around trauma. Certain training methods involve forcing creatures to hold items that reduce their health or cause passive damage over time. These items make creatures stronger through suffering, essentially torturing them into improved performance. The games present this as normal training methodology without questioning the ethics. Some creatures are explicitly stated to experience fear or pain in their Pokédex entries, descriptions that highlight their vulnerability and capacity for suffering. These entries exist alongside game mechanics that allow these same creatures to be captured, battled, and traded like commodities. The disconnect between acknowledging creature suffering and enabling it through gameplay mechanics creates uncomfortable cognitive dissonance. Evolutionary stones force transformation when applied, giving creatures no choice in whether to evolve. A creature might be happy in its current form, but stone evolution overrides that preference immediately. The irreversible nature of stone evolution means mistakes can't be corrected. Creatures permanently changed because their trainers made decisions for them. Some creatures are described as dangerous to humans, attacking unprovoked or causing harm through mere proximity. These creatures are still captured and used by trainers, with no discussion of the risk involved in keeping genuinely dangerous creatures in populated areas. A creature that drains life force or causes illness simply by existing shouldn't be kept as a companion, yet the games never acknowledge this. Legendary creatures forced into captivity represent even greater ethical violations. These beings possess intelligence equal or superior to humans, awareness of cosmic forces, and perspective spanning centuries or millennia. Capturing such beings and forcing them to fight at human command amounts to enslaving gods. The games sometimes present scenarios where creatures are used as labor, mining operations, or construction projects powered by captured creatures. This industrial use of creatures as living tools crosses the line from partnership to exploitation, creatures reduced to their utility rather than valued as individuals. Certain criminals use creatures for violent crimes, theft, assault, or murder. The creatures themselves are treated as weapons rather than accomplices, arrested alongside their trainers, but granted less agency. If creatures are intelligent enough for criminal liability, they should be treated as partners in crime. If they're not, then trainers bear full responsibility for commands given. The release of dangerous criminals sometimes includes them retaining their creatures, with no concern for how those creatures might be used to commit further crimes. A system that allows confirmed criminals to keep powerful creatures seems designed to enable recidivism. Dark-type moves include tactics explicitly described as cruel or underhanded, striking at weak points, or exploiting fears. These moves are taught to creatures and used in sanctioned battles without ethical consideration. Teaching creatures to fight dirty and target vulnerabilities normalizes behavior that would be considered dishonorable in human combat. Some creature abilities cause severe status effects, paralysis, poison, burns, or freezing. These conditions cause pain and suffering that extends beyond the battle where they're inflicted. Creatures can be left burned or poisoned indefinitely, suffering passively until healed. The casual use of these debilitating effects suggests either that they cause less suffering than they would in reality, or that creature suffering simply isn't a priority concern. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, we encounter theories about specific regions and their hidden darkness. One region in particular, the first revealed to players, contains numerous hints of recent warfare. An older trainer mentions fighting in a war, the only direct reference to armed conflict between humans in the main series. The shortage of adult men in this region supports the war theory. Most settlements show predominantly female populations, with children and women vastly outnumbering adult men. If a war occurred recently enough to be within living memory, and if that war primarily drafted men, the demographic imbalance makes sense. Orphaned children appear throughout the region, kids living alone or being raised by relatives. The games never explain why so many children lack parents, but war would provide explanation. Children orphaned by conflict would need care, and extended family or older siblings would fill parental roles. The region contains a tower dedicated to deceased creatures, a memorial suggesting that creature death is common enough to require dedicated space for mourning. While the games claim creatures simply faint in battle, the memorial suggests that death happens with regularity. Perhaps the tower commemorates creatures that died in the war, casualties of conflict humans waged. The specific mention of military service by one character proves that organized armed forces existed, meaning the war wasn't mere regional conflict, but involved formal military structures. This implies larger scale combat than simple skirmishes, potentially involving hundreds or thousands of soldiers. No ruins or destroyed buildings remain visible, suggesting that either the war occurred elsewhere, and this region provided soldiers, or enough time has passed for reconstruction. The trainer who mentions the war appears middle-aged, placing the conflict decades in the past. This timing allows for recovery and rebuilding while explaining the lingering demographic effects. Other regions show evidence of ancient conflicts, ruins, and abandoned structures suggesting civilizations that rose and fell. Some ruins contain active defensive systems or sealed chambers, suggesting they weren't simply abandoned, but rather deliberately locked down. What happened to the people who built these places, and what dangers did they seal away? Certain regions feature extensive underground complexes, tunnel systems, and caverns that seem artificially expanded or deliberately constructed. These underground areas might have served as shelters during conflicts, places where populations hid from threats above. The extensive nature of these complexes suggests prolonged occupation, people living underground for extended periods. One region's central city was nearly destroyed by legendary creatures relatively recently, flooding that forced evacuation and resettlement. The city's reconstruction happened within living memory, with older characters remembering the disaster. This establishes that legendary creatures can and do threaten population centers, and that current cities exist only because past attacks failed or were averted. Weather patterns in some regions are explicitly unnatural, created or maintained by legendary creatures. These artificial weather systems benefit human populations, but dependence on legendary cooperation creates vulnerability. If the legendaries withdraw their protection or turn hostile, the regions they maintain would become uninhabitable. Certain areas remain perpetually dangerous, routes or caves filled with strong creatures that attack humans on sight. These danger zones persist across generations, never becoming safe despite human technological advancement. The inability to secure these areas suggests either that the creatures there are too powerful to remove, or that the government lacks motivation to protect citizens from known threats. Some regions contain active volcanoes or seismic fault lines, geological instabilities that threaten population centers. Cities are built despite these dangers, with minimal precautions or evacuation plans. The casual acceptance of geological risk suggests either extreme confidence in prediction and prevention systems or normalized complacency toward danger. Environmental destruction appears in several regions, polluted waters or deforested areas showing the impact of human activity. The games that sometimes address environmental themes, but solutions rely on legendary creatures intervening rather than human behavior changing. This dependence on divine intervention suggests that humans in the Pokémon world lack either the will or capability to solve environmental problems themselves. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, we encounter theories about creatures that used to be human, transformations driven by curse, tragedy, or experiment gone wrong. Several ghost-type species have Pokédex entries explicitly stating they originated as humans, particularly children who died under specific circumstances. One ghost type is described as the spirit of a child who died lost in a forest. The child's spirit became protective of the woods, guarding against others meeting the same fate. This transformation from human child to forest guardian suggests that strong emotion or unfinished business at death can fundamentally alter what a spirit becomes. Another ghost wears a mask resembling its face from when it was human, carrying the object as a reminder of its lost humanity. The entries describe looking beneath the mask as dangerous, seeing what lies behind causing sickness or even death. The implication is that the transformation from human to creature creates something so changed that viewing it directly harms living minds. A spirit possessing a sword is described as originating from a human warrior whose soul became trapped in their weapon at death. The warrior's skill and fighting spirit transferred to the blade, creating a creature that is both weapon and wielder. This fusion of human consciousness with the inanimate object creates a being neither fully alive nor truly dead. The transformation from human to creature isn't always portrayed as tragic. Some entries suggest that certain people choose transformation, seeking immortality or power beyond mortal limitations. These voluntary transformations indicate that the boundary between human and creature can be crossed deliberately with sufficient knowledge or willingness. Certain Pokémon evolution stones are rumored to affect humans, though the games never show this directly. Legends in-game speak of people who touched evolution stones and suffered transformations, their bodies changed by energy meant for creatures. These legends are presented as folklore rather than documented fact, but folklore often contains seeds of truth. Some creatures possess humanoid body shapes and high intelligence, blurring the line between creature and person. These humanoid types can learn human language, use tools, and demonstrate problem-solving skills equal to humans. Whether these creatures descended from humans, evolved alongside them, or simply developed similar forms through convergent evolution remains unexplored. Ancient art and carvings sometimes show humans and creatures as less distinct than in modern times, merged forms or hybrid beings, suggesting closer integration between species. These historical depictions might represent artistic stylization or genuine historical truth, periods when the boundary between human and creature was more permeable. Psychic abilities in humans and creatures appear identical, suggesting that humans are simply another type within the broader category of Pokémon. If humans possess abilities identical to creature abilities, and creatures can think and feel like humans, then the distinction between species becomes largely arbitrary. Some dark theories propose that humans are the final evolution of a specific evolutionary line, creatures that evolved intelligence and lost their type-based abilities in exchange for tool use and culture. Under this interpretation, humans aren't separate from creatures, but rather represent one possible evolutionary endpoint. Alternative theories suggest that humans arrived from elsewhere, alien or extra-dimensional beings, who settled in a world already inhabited by creatures. This would explain why humans lack the inherent abilities that even weak creatures possess, why human biology seems less resilient and less adaptable. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you.